Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. In the small coastal village of Blackwater Cove, where I spent my childhood, there stood a house that everyone knew as the House of the Dead. It was once an imposing structure in its days of glory, a grand Victorian mansion with traces of elegance, but now abandoned, consumed by wild ivy and the relentless weight of time. No one dared approach it. We children wouldn't even consider passing by the winding path that led to its rusted gates. The stories about that place were as old as the village itself, and everyone knew the name wasn't an exaggeration. They said the house truly harbored the dead. I'm now 35 years old and have lived in this village my entire life. I never gave importance to these tales. I was always skeptical, a non-believer who found amusement in the superstitions that others followed with such reverence. But no matter how much I doubted the legends, I couldn't ignore the strange attraction that place held over me. As a child, my mother constantly warned me to stay away, but that only fueled my curiosity. I eventually left the village to work in Boston, but after my mother's passing, I decided to return. Time had passed, but little had changed. The village seemed trapped in its routine, and the atmosphere of fear surrounding the old house remained. This time, however, something was different. Rumors circulated that the property was for sale. For anyone else, this idea would be a nightmare. But for me, it was a unique chance to confront the mysteries head-on. I purchased the house for an absurdly low price, thinking I could restore it and perhaps uncover its secrets. When I arrived with my belongings, the reaction from the villagers was one of shock and concern. "This house ain't for the living," warned an elderly man with eyes heavy with fear as he watched me unload my suitcases. I ignored his words, as I always did. The interior of the House of the Dead was a portrait of abandonment. There, time seemed to have stopped, leaving only traces of former opulence. The grand entrance hall was somber and desolate, with once golden walls now marked by strange moisture stains that formed shapes like hands trying to emerge. A thick layer of dust covered everything, erasing any trace of life. The iron chandeliers hung askew, filled with long melted candles. Each step on the wooden floor echoed a creak, as if the entire house was listening. In the main hall, the furniture remained in the same place where it had once been left, covered by yellowed sheets stacked like forgotten ghosts. A black marble fireplace dominated the space, cold, but with recent ashes, as if someone had tried to rekindle the fire to combat the cold that permeated every corner. Heavy black velvet curtains blocked any light from outside, leaving the environment eternally submerged in twilight. The air carried a strange smell, a mixture of damp wood, mold, and something more disturbing. Something that reminded me of the touch of the past, of life that no longer existed, but seemed to have never completely departed. At the end of one corridor, I came upon a spiral staircase that led to the upper floors. The twisted iron was enveloped in cobwebs, and each step creaked as if carrying the weight of centuries. The air in the house was so oppressive it seemed to steal my breath, giving the sensation that, with each inhalation, I absorbed the dark histories of the souls that once inhabited this place. During the night, the wind entered through cracks in the windows, creating an almost melodic sound, a lament of distant voices that seemed to spring from the walls themselves. It was as if the dead were trying to reveal their secrets, but were condemned to whisper them eternally, trapped in a cycle of murmurs. At the end of the hallway, a heavy oak door concealed a peculiar room. When I pushed it open, a cutting cold escaped, different from anything I had ever felt. On the floor, enigmatic symbols were engraved in the wood, forming a circle, while the walls displayed deep marks, as if human nails had scratched the plaster with fury. The center of the room was empty, but an almost palpable presence lingered there, making the silence weigh like a stone on my chest. That was the epicenter of something terrible, a void that promised endless suffering. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper stories of pain. It was more than the weight of history. It was the weight of interrupted lives, souls chained to the place, incessantly repeating their torments. The house of the dead wasn't just a ruin, but a living monument where the barriers between life and death had dissolved. No one left the same after crossing that threshold. It took me months to make the house minimally habitable. I managed to restore the ground floor and one of the bedrooms on the second floor. The bathrooms were deplorable, and I had to reconstruct them completely, but the progress encouraged me. I dreamed of the day when that house would once again be a symbol of respect and perhaps luxury. I imagined that over time, someone wealthy would buy the property, attracted by its architectural grandeur. Even so, I avoided exploring certain rooms. Despite my excitement and curiosity, my mother's warnings and the persistent fear still haunted me. I resolved to move forward, ignoring the pleas from the villagers to abandon the house of the dead. On the first night, everything seemed normal. The structure was deteriorated, but I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. However, when the clock struck midnight, a subtle change took over the place. An impossible cold breeze, impossible to exist in a closed house, ran through the corridors, accompanied by whispers. At first, I attributed the sound to the wind or the natural creaking of an old house. But the murmurs became clearer, transforming into voices, many voices that wandered from one room to another. They were words I couldn't understand, but they were laden with pain. I walked the corridors trying to locate the source of the sounds, but whenever I believed I was close, they seemed to move away. In the largest and darkest of the bedrooms, the voices intensified. I lit a candle and entered. On the floor were engravings that formed a circle with symbols I had never seen before. The air was suffocating, as if something invisible was trying to expel me. On the walls, dark stains covered much of the space. I thought they were moisture marks, but upon touching them, I realized it was something more sinister, dried blood, yet still damp to the touch. The murmurs transformed into strident screams. I took a trembling step backward, and the candle flame suddenly extinguished, plunging the room into dense and suffocating darkness. The air seemed alive, swirling around me as if something invisible moved through the shadows. Desperate, I tried to flee, but the door slammed violently before me, imprisoning me in the room. It was then that the figures appeared. Shadow forms, vaguely human, began to take shape around the circle on the floor. Pale, distorted faces emerged from the darkness, floating around me with empty, hungry eyes. Their despair was palpable. They were the souls of those who had lost their lives in that place. Terrified, I tried to convince myself it was all a product of my imagination. But the figures remained there, drawing ever closer, extending fleshless hands in my direction. One of them broke the silence. "You belong to us," said a guttural, cold voice that seemed to penetrate directly into my soul. An icy chill traversed my chest, as if that phrase had been carved into me. I remembered amidst the panic my mother's warnings. Never enter that house, Alonso. It's full of souls that find no rest, and if you stay, they'll drag you along with them. Few in the village spoke about what happened there in the past, but the stories were known long before the village resembled what it is today. A family arrived to live in that mansion that they had commissioned to be built. The workers received orders to maintain absolute silence. Everything was shrouded in mystery. Initially, nobody cared, but with the passing of time, doubts began to emerge. Screams of pain and despair echoed during the night. Cars arrived at the property, but were rarely seen leaving. The mansion, now called the House of the Dead, was built in the 19th century by a man known only as the Doctor. He presented himself as a scholar of medicine, but behind this facade was an insane man, obsessed with creating perfect human beings. In his view, humanity was ruined and incomplete, and only he possessed the solution. The house wasn't a simple home. It was a laboratory of horrors disguised as a clinic. In the basement, hidden from outside view, there were padded rooms, metal tables equipped with straps, and rusty surgical instruments that seemed pulled from a nightmare. The basement was the heart of that nightmare. Tunnels and hidden chambers composed the space where the doctor performed his atrocities. The walls were marked by scratches made by victims, witnesses to their last moments of despair. In the darkest corners, bloodstains were still encrusted in the tiles, a silent reminder of the barbarity that occurred there. The surgical tables, now covered in dust and rust, still displayed the worn leather straps that the doctor used to subdue his patients. The atmosphere was suffocating. The sealed windows and oppressive silence made every space feel like a prison. Even the air seemed complicit, as if guarding the secrets of the past and the souls that were condemned there. The surgical tools were arranged on shattered glass shelves, surrounded by jars that once held human parts preserved in liquids, now dry and covered in dust. The doctor was not content simply to take lives. His methods were even more macabre. He subjected his victims to grotesque procedures, believing that by modifying the human body, he would achieve perfection. However, what he truly created were living horrors. Many survived the surgeries for brief moments, only to die in agony shortly afterward. Those who didn't succumb immediately had even crueler fates. They were left to wander the house, prisoners of bodies incapable of supporting life as it should be. With time, legends emerged among the village residents, not only because of the terrifying screams that occasionally escaped the mansion, but because some claimed to have spotted the failed experiments wandering the fields around it. The police investigated the property on various occasions, but never found concrete evidence. The doctor was skilled at hiding his tracks. However, when he was finally detained, it wasn't by justice, but by those he had tortured himself. The mutilated souls, incapable of enduring more suffering, rebelled in a bloody end. They killed him on the same operating table where so many lives had been destroyed. After his death, the house remained abandoned, but the evil that originated there never departed. Those who dared to enter afterwards reported having seen restless shadows of victims trapped in the same rooms where they lost their lives. Others claimed to hear dragging footsteps in the empty corridors, as if the doctor's creations still wandered. Those who know the true story understand that the house of the dead is not just a haunted place. It's a trap, a space where tortured souls and the remains of ill-fated experiments wait, hungry for company, ready to imprison anyone who crosses its doors. It's the same fate that the unsuspecting faced at the hands of the doctor. The legends weren't exaggerations. The house of the dead didn't just serve to frighten children. It was a place of perdition, a limbo where spirits trapped between life and death waited patiently for their next victim. Gathering all the courage that still remained in me, I ran to the door and smashed it with punches and pushes until it opened. I launched myself into the corridor, leaving behind the screams of the spirits. I descended the stairs in a rush and left the house without looking back. I knew I had escaped, but I also knew that the shadows wouldn't give me peace. I had awakened something that wouldn't stop until it captured me. It was the last time they saw me in the village. I returned to my mother's house, grabbed my car, and left, never to return again. The house of the dead continues there, with unfinished renovations and an open door, as if certain that no one would ever have the courage to cross its threshold again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Catherine, and for more than 2 decades, I've worked as a long-haul truck driver. Since an early age, my life has been marked by endless highways and diesel engines. At just 20 years old, I started in the profession with a transport company in northern Washington state. Since then, I've traversed countless miles across America's highways and backroads. During these years, I've experienced everything, witnessed tragedies and accidents, spectacular sunrises over the Montana plains, and on some occasions, faced situations of great danger, including armed robberies, and even being briefly held hostage at a remote truck stop in Nevada. Despite being a difficult profession, it has brought me many fulfillments, and I value every moment. This career isn't for everyone. The solitude of long journeys and the exhausting hours behind the wheel often weigh heavily. But I've learned to face the fatigue, stress, and constant risks, especially when driving through the night. Over time, I've helped colleagues in difficulties and provided assistance to stranded motorists. Once I even found myself in the middle of a shootout between rival gangs at a desert rest area, and by sheer luck, managed to escape unharmed. Despite everything, there's something about the road that enchants me, a sense of freedom that captivates and fascinates me. I remember one foggy night in particular. I received a call to drive a vehicle parked in the company yard near Highway 16 to a repair shop for maintenance. It wasn't unusual to perform these overnight transfers, as at that time, My job was to move vehicles between different bases rather than operating passenger routes. However, on that night, something in the air felt different. I left home around 11 o'clock. Traffic was rare, and the sky was laden with thick, dark clouds. When I arrived at the yard, the place was deserted and cold. As I got out of my car, a gust of freezing wind made me shiver, and a strange feeling of discomfort took hold of me. I found a few mechanics and the dispatcher, who informed me that the vehicle needed to be taken for repairs to the exhaust system. The journey would be long, and after the repair, I was supposed to return to the central base. I drove the damaged vehicle slowly. At one point, I decided to stop at a small roadside diner to have coffee and eat something. The ambience of the place was cozy, contrasting with the gloomy weather outside. I sat at the counter, ordered a plate of pancakes and strong, hot coffee. While eating, I overheard murmurs from other customers about mysterious accidents on that highway. A trucker with a stern countenance was relating that survivors of incidents usually mentioned a girl who suddenly appeared in the middle of the road, or whose laments echoed in the distance at a specific stretch. They say it's the spirit of a girl who died in an accident there many years ago, commented an elderly woman who appeared to be the owner of the diner. Those who see her end up facing some misfortune. I'm not superstitious, but it's curious how several people tell the same story. Others say it could be an abandoned child. There have been crimes in the region, and bodies are found on the roadside at dawn. Added an older transport worker with a heavy look. My cousin brought some crosses for a family that lost their lives there, including a little girl. I'd never been one to believe in ghost stories, so I didn't pay much attention to the old-timers' conversation. I continued on my way, without letting myself be shaken by the legends. But as I advanced, the fog became denser, and visibility reduced so much that I had to considerably decrease my speed. With darkness taking over and the fog growing heavier, I couldn't avoid the stories heard in the diner beginning to circle my mind. Could it be true, I thought, as a shiver ran up my spine. The road ahead seemed to disappear amid the thick veil of fog. My eyes could barely follow the asphalt line, and nervousness began to take over. As I rounded a curve, the darkness became even more oppressive. An inexplicable sensation of weight enveloped me, and the fear I had tried to ignore slowly infiltrated my mind. As I crossed a bridge, something caught my attention and froze my blood. The figure of a girl standing at the edge of the road. Her outline seemed to float in the mist, and even without clearly seeing her face, her simple presence made me shudder. Suddenly, a long and frightening lament echoed through the air, as if coming from a very distant place. The sound hit me like a blade, and in shock, I turned the wheel, almost losing control of the truck. Instead of stopping, I accelerated. The only thing I could think of was to flee from that vision as quickly as possible. My mind was chaos, functioning only on the survival instinct. Each meter of the road seemed to drag, making the journey endless. And then, as if the nightmare was repeating itself, I saw the same spectral figure again in the middle of the road. It was the girl. It seemed impossible that she could have moved so quickly, as if she had emerged from nowhere. With my heart racing and overcome by panic, I stepped on the brake with all my strength. The truck stopped abruptly with a scream of tires, and for a moment everything was silent. I looked ahead, and there was nothing more. The girl had disappeared. Sweat ran down my face, and my chest seemed about to explode with fear. Terror dominated me, and I could only murmur a prayer. My God, protect me from all evil. Take away whatever is bad from me. My words came out with desperation, as if each one could form a barrier against whatever was lurking. After minutes that seemed like an eternity, I managed to regain some control and restarted the truck. There was no other option but to continue. But each mile was traveled with extreme caution and a constant prayer in my thoughts. The road remained darker than ever, enveloped in a fog that seemed almost solid. Despite the panic growing in my chest, I knew I needed to continue. My heart was racing, and my breathing was short and rapid. The truck advanced slowly as I tried to concentrate. But then something even more frightening happened. I saw the girl inside the vehicle. She was walking between the seats, her deep eyes fixed on me. An intense cold ran through my body as I noticed her presence. I had no idea how she had entered the truck, or at what moment this had occurred. My entire body was paralyzed with fear. My eyes tried to focus on the road, but my hands trembled so much on the wheel that it was difficult to control the vehicle. Each meter traveled seemed an enormous effort. Finally, upon passing an intersection, the figure disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared, as if she had evaporated. I thought that was the end of the nightmare, but I was wrong. After that encounter, the specter seemed to be everywhere, not just on the road, but also inside the truck and even at the repair shop. The mechanics, who began to notice strange things, commented about distant laughter and footsteps that echoed through the cab. Everyone knew exactly what it was, but no one had the courage to speak about it openly. The girl seemed attached to the truck, as if her presence was marked there forever. I avoided telling others about what was happening, fearing they would laugh at me or call me crazy. To my surprise, I discovered that other drivers had also gone through similar situations. Some reported having seen the girl's specter in trucks, and according to rumors, some even died of fright. The situation in the repair shop became unsustainable. The mechanics avoided working on my vehicle, and the environment became charged. One of the more devout men suggested that the spirit might be seeking rest, and that candles or prayers might be necessary to free it. I decided I needed to face my fear. One night, after finishing repairs on the truck, I returned alone to the vehicle. The mechanics remained outside, observing. My heart was beating so hard that it seemed to echo through the empty space. I spoke aloud, my voice broken by tension. "What do you want? Why don't you leave us in peace?" For a few moments, only the sound of my breathing filled the silence. Then a lament arose, followed by an icy whisper that traversed my body like a cutting wind. "Return to the highway." With fear but determination, I resolved to follow the instruction. The following night, I drove to the same stretch of road where I had first seen her. The fog was again dense, and the darkness seemed even more impenetrable. When I reached the bridge, I stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and waited. The silence was crushing, and uncertainty dominated me as fear took deep root in my mind. It wasn't long before the girl's spectral figure appeared again. This time, she was at the edge of a section that led to a small ravine. However, her presence didn't terrify me as much as before. Something inside me said there was a purpose there, something I needed to understand. "What do you want me to do?" I silently asked from the truck. She didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to point to a spot on the road. I followed what her gaze indicated, advancing to the location. The night's cold seemed to penetrate my skin, but I continued until I spotted something that had previously gone unnoticed: a bunch of wilted flowers and a fabric doll thrown at the edge of the asphalt. A profound sadness took hold of me, as if that child's pain had invaded me. Suddenly, it all made sense. That place must be where the girl had lost her life. Her spirit was trapped without rest because no one had honored her memory. It was my chance to do something, to help her find peace. I returned to the truck to get a canvas bag and a larger flashlight. The intense light from the flashlight illuminated the path, while the night's silence was occasionally broken by the noise of the few vehicles that passed. I returned to the place where the bouquet and the doll were. My heart was beating rapidly, but I did not hesitate. It wasn't just about collecting forgotten objects. It was an act of dignity for a lost soul. I carefully picked up the items, feeling the symbolic weight they carried. The bouquet was dry and dusty, the fabric doll torn by time. Both had been forgotten, ignored for years. As I looked at the remains of a wooden cross, already worn by time, I felt a tightness in my heart. I thought of the family that perhaps had stopped visiting that place, allowing forgetfulness to take over. Carefully, I stored everything in the bag, promising myself that I would do something to preserve the memory of that girl. The next day, I went to a nearby cemetery to give these objects a more dignified destination. Arriving there, the environment seemed different. The silence was interrupted only by the soft song of birds and the light sound of the wind. I walked among the tombstones, each telling stories of lives that once existed, until I found a small, well-cared-for mausoleum. It was a special place dedicated to children, where people left toys and lit candles. The place seemed to radiate a kind of comfort. With respect, I buried the bouquet of flowers and the doll there, near the mausoleum. I felt I was fulfilling something greater. Upon seeing the flowers mixing with the earth, I had the sensation that finally, that spirit had found rest. Before departing, I returned to the highway and placed a small cement cross at the place where the tragedy had probably happened. There was no name on that cross, but it represented a gesture of love and respect. It was a tribute to someone forgotten by the world, but who, at that moment, seemed to have finally been remembered. I lit a candle and said a prayer for her soul. As the flame danced gently, I felt something almost indescribable, as if the wind itself carried a silent thank you. That simple gesture seemed to bring the relief that the spirit so needed. A feeling of peace took hold of me, and for a brief moment, the sadness that had accompanied me since the beginning of this story disappeared. On the third day, I noticed that the girl's presence had ceased. The truck and the repair shop returned to routine, and the mechanics no longer mentioned the strange events. Despite this, that night and the image of the little one remained deeply marked in my memory. The experience taught me something important. Sometimes spirits just need to be heard. They need someone to help them find the peace they didn't have in life. My journey along the highways continued, but whenever I passed that specific stretch, I felt a warmth in my chest. An inevitable smile emerged when remembering that, somehow, I had done something significant for her, or at least for the memory she carried with her. The first time I heard about a detour on Hollow Mountain Road happened on a night marked by relentless rain and impenetrable darkness. As a trucker, I routinely faced the dangers of the road, but I admit that nothing could have prepared me for what that night had in store. I had been driving for hours, returning from a delivery to an isolated town in rural Oregon. My destination was Seattle, where I planned to enjoy a few days off to surprise my wife on her birthday. I planned to arrive early to celebrate with her, but upon entering a road surrounded by dense forest, a heavy fog made visibility almost non-existent, forcing me to drive with extreme caution. That's when I noticed the detour. It wasn't on any map I knew, but something urged me to follow it. Besides, there were reports on the CB radio of traffic jams and several accidents on the main route, which would certainly delay my arrival. I decided that taking this mysterious shortcut was the best option, hoping to rejoin the main road before midnight and reach my destination by morning as planned. As I advanced, the path became even narrower, and the fog turned almost suffocating. Visibility was so low that I could barely see beyond the hood of the truck, which forced me to drive at a crawl. The sensation was strange, almost surreal, as if I had entered a dimension where time flowed in a peculiar and disconcerting manner. After a long journey that seemed to last an eternity, I came upon a small town in the middle of nowhere. The old, weathered houses appeared abandoned, although some displayed flickering lights. I decided to stop at a roadside bar, one of those common places in the region where I could eat something and find out where I was, since my map didn't indicate this town. I had completely departed from the interstate. As soon as I entered the establishment, I noticed suspicious glances from the few residents who were there. They observed me in silence, as if waiting for something frightening. As I approached the counter, I noticed the tension stamped on their thin faces, which left me uneasy. "Good evening," I said, trying to break the hostile atmosphere. "I'm lost and ended up here. Could you tell me where I am?" The man behind the counter, middle-aged and with a striking scar on his face, took time to respond, analyzing me with a firm gaze. "You're in Shadow Creek, trucker. This place doesn't appear on maps for good reasons. Nobody cares about this forgotten corner, and that's better this way. They say it's cursed, that things here are confused, but that's how we like it. Those who live here don't want visitors." Curious, I asked him to tell me more. With a heavy air, he began to relate something that chilled me to the bone, while serving me a shot of liquor that almost made my teeth lock. Before beginning, he assured me it was just one sip, and that I didn't need to worry. The story he told had roots in ancient beliefs of the place. According to the bartender, a dark and malevolent being roamed the roads around. No one knew for certain what it was, but everyone agreed that it took people, either from their homes while they slept, or when they had the misfortune of crossing its path. Many accidents had occurred because of it, and that's why no one risked driving to those forgotten parts. To protect themselves from possible tragedies, the residents stocked their houses with goods from surrounding villages, avoiding dependence on deliveries. No transport vehicle reached Shadow Creek. The most disturbing part was what the bartender recounted. People taken by that creature simply disappeared forever, without leaving a trace. While listening to the story, a painful fragment of memory emerged forcefully. My son had disappeared years ago precisely while crossing this region one night. I remembered the disturbing phone call, the wavering tone of his voice, and the moment when his mother, answering, heard the word Shadow Creek just before the call dropped. My heart raced. Finally, everything made sense. I needed to know more. My son disappeared in this area years ago. I revealed with a voice laden with emotion. Do you think this thing is related to it? The bartender made a slow movement with his head, confirming. Many here have lost relatives the same way. Some believe the creature chooses its victims for reasons only it understands. But what is this? Why doesn't anyone try to confront it? Because it's not something we can combat. This thing appeared a long time ago, arrived along with strange lights in the sky. Some say they're witches, others speak of beings from another world. The truth, friend, is that nobody knows for sure. Determined to obtain answers, I decided to spend the night and part of the following day in the town. I spoke with several people who had lost loved ones, and all shared similar accounts, mysterious disappearances, and a latent fear that prevented them from acting. Among these conversations, I met Samuel, a man who had lost his son in circumstances frighteningly similar to those I was investigating. His account left me marked that night as we shared coffee in his modest house. Samuel began to narrate his story with a voice choked with pain. His eyes revealed accumulated suffering. It was about 5 years ago. My son disappeared suddenly. He was a strong young man, full of courage. That night he returned from work, and we talked a little before dinner. When I went to call him, I realized he wasn't there. I waited, but the delay made me go out to look for him in the woods. I spent hours shouting his name without response. I didn't know I was on the edge of a nightmare. Samuel recounted how he wandered through the forest for days, following vague clues that seemed to lead nowhere, until finally finding something. I saw marks on the ground, huge footprints, as if something heavy had been dragged. I followed the trail to a dark, damp cave. At first I thought it was a shelter, but I realized I was facing a trap. Inside the cave, he found human remains. There were bones scattered on the floor, pieces of worn clothing. And in the midst of it all, the shirt of his son's work uniform with the embroidered name. Samuel paused for a moment, his voice breaking as he relived the pain. Before I could react, I felt that something was behind me. He described the horror he saw, a grotesque creature, an absurd fusion of man and beast. The eyes of the being shone with an impossible-to-describe malice. Its body was a frightening combination of muscles and dense fur. It had enormous claws, sharp as blades, and a nauseating smell that mixed blood and rottenness. Samuel could still feel the terror of that night every time he closed his eyes. The creature advanced against me with ferocity, but I managed to dodge by a hair's breadth. I ran through the cave, feeling my heart about to explode, while the awareness that my life depended on not stopping pushed me forward. The thought of how my son must have suffered at the hands of that thing pierced me like a blade. The struggle for survival was desperate. He used everything he found, rocks, pieces of wood, and even his own hands. The creature attacked him several times, leaving him injured and bleeding. but he refused to give up. Samuel showed his arm, where a long, thin scar denounced the confrontation. In a critical moment, I managed to hit it in the eye with a pointed stone while it was biting me. It screamed and retreated, giving me the chance to escape. I ran without looking back, certain that if I hesitated, it would be my end. He returned to the town exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Like so many others who survived, his detailed account of the hybrid creature and the remains found in the cave caused a mixture of panic and resignation among the inhabitants. Everyone already suspected the existence of something sinister in the woods, but hearing the story with so many details confirmed their deepest fears. Despite the desire to act, to seek help from the government, their attempts to obtain support were ignored. After all, who would give credit to a story about monsters lurking in the mountain? The creature, according to them, had been hunting them for months, always in the shadows. Some believed it was part of a group of similar beings, but it was the most dangerous. Where they came from, why they were there, nobody knew. The only certainty was that keeping distance from the forest and the road during the night was a matter of survival. The residents had even tried to combat them, exploring caves and valleys in search of their hideouts, but they only found signs of destruction and mortal remains. The town lived under constant fear. Disappearances were frequent, and stories about the creature further fueled the terror and superstitions. While listening to Samuel, I realized my search wasn't just for answers, it was for justice. The creature that took my son and so many others should be stopped. That night, while sleeping in my truck, I was awakened by a strange sound. I opened my eyes and looked through the window. The fog was so dense that almost nothing could be seen, but a shadowy figure moved among the shadows. A shiver ran through my body. The idea of being face to face with something from the legends filled me with dread, but also with determination. I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the truck, and with the clock marking close to 3 in the morning, I faced the darkness. The silhouette disappeared and reappeared in the fog, as if wanting to guide me. Without hesitation, I took the pistol I kept in the glove compartment and followed the figure. I walked for a time that seemed interminable, until reaching a cluster of gigantic rocks. In the absolute silence, an abandoned shed stood out among the stones. It was evident that it had long served to store machinery, but now only rusty structures remained, infested with insects. I entered slowly, cautious, with my senses on alert. Inside, I found an altar covered with personal objects, photographs, pieces of clothing, jewelry. Among them, one item caught my attention and made my heart freeze: my son's watch. Upon realizing that these items were offerings to the creatures of the forest, a disturbing hypothesis took shape in my mind. The residents' fear was so great that perhaps they themselves were responsible for eliminating people and leaving their belongings and bodies as tribute. Fragments of bones and bloodstains confirmed the horror. Revolt and despair exploded inside me. I shouted my son's name, but silence was the only response. Then I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly and saw the creature, tall and gaunt, with bright eyes that overflowed with malice. Its appearance was indescribable, a materialized nightmare. I fired without thinking, but it moved with superhuman speed. The bullets didn't seem to have an effect. In an instant, the creature advanced, its claws tearing my clothes and skin. I managed to disengage myself and fired again, this time hitting its side. With a guttural sound, it retreated, licking the wound with a snout that defied any classification, something between human and animal, a creation that should never have existed. I advanced, determined to end this, but when I was about to fire the final shot, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Don't hurt the Wendigo," shouted the bartender, suddenly appearing. I turned incredulous, without lowering my weapon. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice laden with fury. The bartender raised his hands in a gesture of appeal. "The Wendigo is an ancient creature. We've lived with it for generations. It protects us in its way. We maintain a pact. We feed its hunger to ensure our safety. We prefer not to question. We're sorry about your son. We didn't know he would be a victim." My mind spun between anger and incredulity. "You're sacrificing people. This is a monster that devours our children," I shouted, pointing the gun at him. Before I could shoot, I felt a strong impact on the back of my neck. Everything went dark, and my consciousness faded. When I woke up, I was back in my truck, parked on the main road. The fog had disappeared, and dawn was breaking on the horizon. I looked around, dazed. There were no signs of the detour, nor a trace of Shadow Creek. It was as if everything had been erased. On the passenger seat, I found my son's watch, the same one I had seen among the offerings to the Wendigo. Its gleam was the confirmation that it had not been a dream. Since then, I continue on the roads in search of answers, hoping to find something that clarifies the fate of my son. And every time I see a detour on the way, a shiver runs down my spine. I hope one of them will lead me back to Shadow Creek. But to this day, I have never found that community again. I've learned that there are things in this world that defy explanation, mysteries that may never be solved. And Shadow Creek, apparently, is one of them. During a period of my life, I lived in a bustling high-rise apartment complex in Chicago. Unlike in suburban America, it was common for us to live in close proximity to one another. The building had an impressive 40 floors, each with approximately 25 apartments. The place buzzed with activity, inhabited mostly by young university students or newlyweds starting their families. Back then, my routine was intense, especially on Friday nights when I'd go straight from college to my night job at a downtown bar. On one of these early mornings, around 1 o'clock, I returned home as usual. I called the elevator to go up to the 11th floor, where my apartment was located. In this building, certain nights always had a considerable flow of people using the elevators. It was unpredictable what you might encounter, from intoxicated individuals to eccentric figures returning from a night out. I had witnessed it all. After a few minutes of waiting, the elevator arrived. I entered, pressed the button for my floor, and noticed, just as the door closed, that there was a man standing silently in the corner. He wore a ski mask and thick gloves. Realizing his presence so late at night caused me immediate discomfort, but it was too late to back out. I decided to ignore him, staring firmly at the elevator door while my heart raced. 1,000 thoughts crossed my mind. Why hadn't I been more attentive before entering? As we ascended, I looked at the panel and saw that we still had 7 floors to go. Instinctively, I reached into my pocket and grabbed my keys, forming a sort of improvised claw with my fingers. Although my weapon was rudimentary, I tried to mentally prepare myself to react if necessary. My daydreams about self-defense were interrupted by the sound of drops falling. I couldn't resist looking in the direction of the noise, and saw a reddish puddle of blood forming at the stranger's feet. My eyes automatically traveled upward, following the dripping to find an enormous military knife covered in blood. The sight transformed any idea of fighting with my fragile keys into a pathetic thought. Before panic could take hold of me, the most comforting sound in the world echoed, the ding, indicating my arrival at the floor. With a rigid body and hurried steps, I exited the elevator, entered my apartment, and locked the door. Through the peephole, I observed that the man remained inside for some time. Afterward, I felt safe enough to try to sleep. The next morning, news of a murder in the building spread. Soon after, I heard knocks on my door. It was a detective conducting an investigation. He asked if I had seen anything suspicious that could help with the investigation. I promptly denied it, remaining indifferent. Cases involving drug cartels or gangs weren't rare in that area, and I saw no reason to get involved. Besides, collaborating would mean losing a day of work, a luxury I couldn't afford. The officer thanked me and left. I confess that in the following weeks, I opted to use the stairs. Sometime later, I saw on television a report announcing that the suspect had been arrested. To my surprise, the culprit was a police officer, a detective from the very precinct that had been investigating the murder. Later, evidence revealed that this officer had been involved in a complex blackmail scheme with several victims in the building. His technique was to use the elevator late at night, knowing that scared residents would be unlikely to report the intimidating figure. The detective had been using his position to silence victims and cover his tracks. The case ended up exposing a network of corruption involving several other officers who had been running a protection racket in the neighborhood for years. If I had spoken up that night, perhaps more lives could have been saved. The thought has haunted me ever since. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if my silence made me complicit. The reality is that fear can make us blind to the right thing to do. That night in the elevator taught me that sometimes what we should fear most isn't the obvious monster, but the ones hiding behind badges and authority. I moved out of that building shortly after the trial concluded. I couldn't bear to take that elevator anymore, not because I feared encountering another masked killer, but because every time those doors closed, I'd remember the moment when I chose self-preservation over truth. If you're comfortable in bed, think twice before getting up. This belief has gained traction lately. The idea that once you've settled in for the night, leaving your home could invite disaster. Some say it's just superstition, while others point to frightening coincidences as proof. Christian's story perfectly illustrates this perspective. Christian worked at a large retail store in a small town in Montana, putting in 12-hour shifts Monday through Saturday. Sundays were his only chance to rest. He wasn't much for partying, preferring to stay home, though he noticed his coworkers always went out on Saturday nights. One particular Saturday, he called in sick, claiming illness when in reality, he just wanted to rest. By 11 at night, he was in bed, but close to midnight, his phone rang. Answering groggily, he heard his drunk colleagues insisting he join them for drinks. "I'm already in bed," he replied irritably and hung up. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time they promised an unforgettable night. Not wanting to be labeled the boring one, Christian eventually gave in. He asked them to pick him up, and soon they were at his door. As he descended the stairs, something troubled him, a bad feeling. He ignored it and left anyway. In the car, he found 2 more colleagues, all intoxicated. He asked them to drive carefully, but they didn't listen. They headed toward another town, about 30 minutes away. After 10 minutes, they crossed through a deserted, dark area until they reached a gas station. While the driver was filling up, another colleague got out to buy beer. That's when Christian noticed a black pickup with tinted windows pulling into the station. A man with a rural appearance stepped out, but Christian's already drunk colleague began provoking him. Ignored, the young man impulsively grabbed a beer bottle and threw it at the pickup's windshield, shattering it. In panic, he ran back to the car, but not before Christian saw 4 masked men emerging from the vehicle. As soon as their car started, his colleague jumped in and they sped away. The black pickup began pursuing them. The driver pushed the car to its limits on that dark, deserted road. Twice they nearly plunged off a cliff, but managed to regain control. Despite this, the pickup didn't give up. On a straight stretch, it caught up and forced them to brake suddenly. 4 masked men got out, along with the older man, all armed with rifles. Seeing the weapons paralyzed them. Christian's body trembled, his heart raced, and cold sweat ran down his face. The men dragged them from the car, forced them to their knees at the roadside, and declared this would be their end. Panicking, they begged for their lives, explaining it had been a mistake, that the responsible party was drunk, and that they would pay for the broken windshield. However, the men only threatened them with words that chilled Christian to the bone. Eventually, the armed men left, taking one of Christian's colleagues with them. That same night, they filed a police report, but to this day, the missing man has never been found. Christian often thinks about that night, and how different things might have been if he had just stayed in bed after deciding to rest for the night. The sense that the day had ended and disturbing that balance seemed to invite negative events, a perspective that has haunted him ever since. Avoid leaving home after you've already gone to bed. What wakes you at that moment might be death itself. This was the advice my mother always gave me. For a long time, I thought it was just another superstition, until something happened that changed my perspective forever. It was about a year ago. I was attending university in Boston, drowning in coursework. After a particularly grueling day of classes, I returned to my apartment, completed my assignments, and by 10 o'clock, I was fast asleep. I was so exhausted from my workload that I barely noticed the persistent calls from my friends. When I finally checked my phone, it was past 11. I had more than 10 missed calls, and a message saying they were hanging out with some guys, including someone I had feelings for. Despite this tempting information, I chose to ignore the invitation and continue sleeping. At 2 in the morning, my phone rang again. Out of politeness, I answered. My friend Hannah insisted I join them, saying the guy I liked had been asking about me all night. That stirred something inside me, and for a moment I almost got up. But then I remembered my mother's words. What if it was death calling for me? I preferred not to risk it. I turned off my phone, laid back down, and surrendered to sleep. The next morning, I woke at 7 and went to university as usual. There I noticed something strange. None of my friends had shown up for class. I assumed they might be hungover and continued with my day. However, when they didn't appear on the second day either, concern began to set in. By the third day of their absence, worry consumed me. I started calling and texting them, but received no response. By the fourth day, I decided to visit Hannah's house. Her mother answered the door, eyes brimming with tears. With a trembling voice, she told me Hannah was in the hospital in critical condition, along with my other friends. They had been in an accident around 3 in the morning. The car they were in had collided with a semi-truck on the highway. The truck driver had been in the wrong lane, and on a curve, the impact was inevitable. The 2 people in the front died instantly. My friends in the back were severely injured, and 2 of them didn't survive, including Hannah. As I stood there, understanding dawned on me with chilling clarity. If I had gotten out of bed that night, I would have been in that car too. The invitation I had received wasn't just from my friends, it was from death itself, and I had unknowingly declined. Since that night, I've held firm to my mother's advice. No matter how enticing the invitation, once I'm in bed for the night, that's where I remain until morning. Some might call it superstition, but I know better now. Sometimes death comes calling in the most ordinary of disguises, and staying put might be all that stands between you and a fate you never saw coming. What woke me that night wasn't just my phone, it was a crossroads, a moment where my path diverged from tragedy. While I mourn my friends every day, I can't help but feel that something was watching over me, whispering my mother's warning when I needed it most. There's an old saying about never waking someone who's already settled down to sleep. Some might dismiss it as coincidence, but I see it differently after what happened in my family. One evening, we gathered at my grandmother's house in rural Oregon to celebrate her birthday. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and joy. Everything was going well until my cousin Nathan, who worked nights as a security guard, arrived. He greeted everyone briefly, then locked himself in the guest room to rest before his shift later that night. As the celebration continued, we realized we had run out of drinks. My Aunt Sarah decided not to bother anyone with the errand except Nathan, who was already resting. Reluctantly, she knocked on his door, waking him up. Nathan emerged from the room visibly exhausted, but my aunt insisted he needed to go to the corner store. Despite his clear fatigue, he eventually gave in. I remember offering to go with him, but he brushed me off, irritated at being disturbed. "These young people today," my aunt muttered as Nathan left, and we continued celebrating, laughing and singing, until we heard gunshots just a few blocks away. The shock was immediate, and everyone rushed out looking for Nathan. We found him walking back toward the house, his face bruised, lip cut, and eyebrow bleeding. He told us he had been mugged. Since he had nothing but the bottles of soda, the thieves had beaten him and fired shots to scare him off. In that moment, I remembered that he had already been sleeping before all this happened. Perhaps if he hadn't been awakened, none of it would have occurred. The thought sent chills down my spine. What made it even more unsettling was what happened later that night. After everyone had calmed down and Nathan had cleaned up his wounds, I overheard him talking to my grandmother in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but I could still make out the words. "It wasn't just a mugging, Grandma," Nathan whispered. When they cornered me, one of them called me by name. They knew who I was. "What do you mean?" my grandmother asked, her voice trembling slightly. I recognized one of them, Nathan continued. "He was at the convenience store last week when I stopped a robbery during my security shift. This wasn't random. They were waiting for me." This revelation made the entire incident even more disturbing. Had Nathan not been awakened, he wouldn't have been targeted by people seeking revenge. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. They must have been watching the house, waiting for an opportunity. Whether it's superstition or precaution, my advice is simple. Think twice before interrupting someone's rest. The world operates in mysterious ways, and sometimes the balance of things is more delicate than we realize. Sometimes what awaits outside isn't just bad luck. It's something or someone with malicious intent, biding their time for the perfect moment to strike. That night taught me that the old warnings often contain more wisdom than we give them credit for. Now, I never wake someone who's sleeping unless it's absolutely necessary. The consequences might be far worse than just dealing with their grumpy mood. Today, I want to share what happened to my son. He had a group of friends who loved to have fun, but their goal wasn't drinking. They enjoyed taking road trips to small scenic towns and exploring local cuisine. It was their Friday night ritual. But one particular night, when my son was already asleep, they showed up at our house in New Hampshire unexpectedly. They had planned a special trip to celebrate his birthday, which was coming up in a few days. Their destination was Portland, Maine, a place my son had always wanted to visit. When they arrived, he asked them to come back the next day, saying he was too tired to go out. His friends left, and I thought they understood. However, later that night, they called him again, and he answered. I heard him get out of bed and start getting dressed. As soon as he opened his bedroom door, I warned him not to go. I told him it was dangerous to go out at night, especially after he'd already settled down to rest, because something bad might happen. He just smiled as if he didn't take my words seriously, and assured me everything would be fine. I insisted one more time, practically begging him to stay home, but he didn't listen. He left with his friends. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting and attempted to calm down. I eventually fell asleep, but at 4 a.m. the phone rang. It was someone from the ambulance service, informing me that my son had been in a serious accident. They were trapped under an overturned semi-truck. Desperately, I asked if he was alive, but the call ended before they could give me more information. I immediately called my wife, who was working the night shift at the hospital, and she rushed home as quickly as she could. Together, we went to the hospital they had mentioned. There we found my son and his friends, all hospitalized. That early morning was absolute torment. They wouldn't let me see my son because he needed to undergo several urgent surgeries. He had fractured many bones and was in critical condition. What made it worse was that the doctors wouldn't tell us if he would make it through the night. As days passed, he began to improve. When he was finally lucid enough for visitors, I was able to see him. As soon as I entered the room, he apologized for not listening to me. He promised he would never again leave the house after already being in bed. He told me that night death had taken one of his friends, the one who had been most insistent that he join them. But somehow he had survived. The truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, crossed the median, and hit them head-on. The doctors later told us it was nothing short of a miracle that anyone survived at all. It's been several years since the accident. Despite the physical scars that remain, my son is alive. He learned his lesson. Since then, he doesn't leave the house once he's settled in for the night. I've observed this closely. Invitations to parties and outings after bedtime. He refuses without hesitation. Sometimes late at night, I'll see him sitting by his window, staring out at the road as if he can see something the rest of us can't. Once when I asked him about it, he just said, "Dad, that night I saw death's face behind the wheel of that truck. It wasn't my time, but I know better than to tempt fate twice." This was my experience, and it's something I'll never forget. The ancient wisdom about not leaving your bed once you've settled in for the night might sound like superstition to some. But in our family, it's a rule we live by, because we know what happens when you ignore it. I'm 23 now, but since I was 15, I had a great companion, my dog Max. He entered my life as a small, lost puppy on the streets of Portland, and from then on, we were inseparable. When I decided to live on my own, I made sure to bring him with me from my parents' house. One Sunday night remains etched in my memory. I was watching television when suddenly the power went out across the entire neighborhood. I hadn't had dinner yet, so I went to a nearby store to get some candles. I placed them on the table, lit them, and ate dinner by candlelight. By 11 o'clock, I was sleeping deeply, until a knock at the door woke me. It was a neighbor, visibly distressed, asking me to drive him somewhere. I work as an Uber driver, and even though something felt off about the situation, I ended up agreeing to help. "Please, it's urgent," he said, clearly anxious. Without thinking much, I went to the kitchen, grabbed my keys, and left in a hurry, forgetting to extinguish the candles. What I didn't realize then was that I had also forgotten to close Max's crate, something I always did when leaving the house at night. The ride took about an hour. My neighbor barely spoke during the journey. He asked me to take him to a remote area outside the city, saying he needed to meet someone. When I asked for details, he just stared out the window, mumbling something about settling old debts. The whole situation made me increasingly uneasy. When I returned home, I noticed something wrong. My apartment was filled with smoke. I rushed to open the door and clear the heavy air. As I entered, I saw that the wooden table was in flames. I covered my face with a damp cloth, opened all the windows, then grabbed water and put out the fire. When the power came back on, I encountered the most painful scene of my life. Max was hidden under another table, motionless. He hadn't survived the smoke that filled the apartment. I discovered later that he had tried to reach the food I'd left on the table, knocking over the candles that ignited the tablecloth, and then the wooden table. Guilt consumed me. I couldn't forgive myself for having left that night and forgetting the candles. But what haunted me even more was the strange coincidence. Or was it something else? The next day, I decided to talk to my neighbor, to ask him more about the urgent meeting that had pulled me from my home at such a critical moment. When I knocked on his door, a different man answered. "He doesn't live here," the man said. "Nobody by that description has lived in this building for at least 5 years." Chills ran down my spine. I described the man in detail, tall, thin, with a distinctive scar above his right eyebrow. The neighbor shook his head. "That sounds like Mr. Harmond. He died in a house fire in this very apartment. Started a fire while cooking and couldn't get out in time." I stood frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. Who had come to my door that night? Who had I driven for an hour, watching as he disappeared into the darkness at our destination, never actually meeting anyone? Sometimes I wonder if it was death itself that knocked on my door that night, not to take me, but to ensure I wasn't home when tragedy struck. Or perhaps it was something more sinister, ensuring I would live with the guilt of Max's death forever. Either way, I now check everything meticulously before leaving my home, especially if I've already settled in for the night. Some doors, once opened, invite more than just the night air inside. The period I spent living in my aunt and uncle's house transformed into a memory that has never faded. They resided in a modest apartment in a predominantly rundown neighborhood in East Baltimore, where violence and poverty were present on every corner. Their only companions seemed to be a small dog and a stray cat, indifferent to the evident decay around them. The street where my aunt and uncle lived was the very portrait of misery. Sidewalks were dominated by makeshift shelters for the homeless, accumulated piles of garbage, and graffiti that seemed to warn anyone who dared enter that territory. The air was impregnated with an unbearable smell of urine, sweat, and something else more difficult to identify, making it almost unbreathable. Screams and arguments were frequent at any hour of the day. Occasionally, police cars would cross the streets, but officers never stayed long. My aunt and uncle, however, seemed indifferent to it all. "It's just part of life here," my uncle would say with disturbing naturalness. Daily, they would send me to the small corner store to buy what was needed. At first, I was afraid to walk alone, but soon realized I had no choice. I walked with my head down, avoiding any eye contact with the groups that gathered on the corners. Some seemed trapped in their own despair, while others appeared merely resigned, living their routines or consuming substances they occasionally tried to offer me. I ignored them and continued on my way. One afternoon, returning from the grocery store, something unexpected happened. I passed by a specific makeshift shelter from which emanated an unbearable odor I had noticed other times. But that day, something was different. The shelter was slightly open. I don't know why, but I approached, driven by a curiosity I can't explain. Inside, I found the body of a man, completely motionless, in an advanced state of decomposition. His tattered, dirty clothes barely hid what remained of his body. The skin, with shades of gray and dark spots, seemed marked by abandonment, and the face, almost unrecognizable, had eyes half open as if he could still see me. A sensation of horror mixed with revulsion paralyzed me. I had never seen a corpse before, much less in such degraded conditions. It was as if time had stopped there, in that instant. Death, raw and implacable, revealed its face in a brutal form. What shocked me even more was the indifference around me. Nobody seemed to notice the terrible smell or the abandoned body. It was as if, in life or in death, that man didn't exist for anyone else. I returned home in silence. My face was pale, my hands trembled, and my mind struggled to comprehend what I had witnessed. No matter how much I tried to forget, the image of that body remained engraved in me. That summer, marked by the suffocating heat and the harshness of the streets, made me realize how implacable life could be. After that day, something in my aunt and uncle's house seemed to have changed. It was something difficult to describe, but the environment became heavier, as if an invisible tension hung in the air. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it soon became clear I wasn't the only one feeling it. The dog, normally calm and friendly, began acting strangely. It barked incessantly, staring fixedly at a corner of the living room, as if seeing something no one else could. There was nothing visible, but the dog remained restless, growling without ceasing, hair bristling and eyes fixed in the direction of a door, the access to a locked basement. The barks reverberated through the small room, filling it with a discomfort that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My aunt and uncle tried to calm the dog, but it seemed possessed by a fear that defied logic, as if seeing something we couldn't perceive. Night after night, the barking intensified, and I began to wake up in the early hours with my heart racing and a bad feeling. Then, one of those nights, the sharp sound pulled me from sleep again. But there was something different this time. The air was icy with a cold that wasn't natural, and the house seemed enveloped in an unusual, suffocating silence. I got up with a heavy feeling in my chest and went to the living room where the dog continued barking desperately. Upon entering, I stopped abruptly. The darkness seemed denser than normal, as if something filled it. There was a presence there, not something that could be seen, but was impossible to ignore. I felt as if an invisible force occupied every corner of the space, impregnating the environment with a hostile, oppressive energy. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't human. It was something beyond, something that shouldn't be there. Suddenly, the dog went silent, becoming motionless with glazed eyes focused on a dark corner of the room. A shiver ran down my spine when I heard an almost imperceptible sound, like a strange whisper. It wasn't a voice, but something that seemed to come from a place I didn't understand. I remained paralyzed, feeling that presence grow, invading everything around me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but when I regained control, I retreated slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on that shadowy corner. Something was there, I was certain. It watched, lurking, and I realized with disturbing clarity that it wouldn't leave so soon. I returned to my room, trembling, diving under the covers as if they were a barrier against that thing. That night, sleep abandoned me. The sensation of being watched persisted, and I understood that something had changed forever in that house. The following days brought a greater weight. My aunt and uncle, though trying to ignore it, began to notice something was wrong. "The dog is just old," they said, trying to convince themselves. "This house has always been cold at night." But I knew it wasn't that simple. I felt it in the strange blowing wind, in the shadows that moved subtly from the corner of my eye, too quick to be explained. One morning, the situation reached its limit. A sharp scream woke me. I ran to the living room and found my aunt kneeling on the floor, crying copiously while holding the motionless body of the dog. It was dead. There were no signs of illness or explanation for what happened, just foam running from its mouth. It was as if it had simply stopped living. My aunt and uncle were perplexed, but still tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy. "It was his time," my uncle mumbled, his voice trembling as he buried the dog in a nearby park. The scene in the living room wouldn't leave my head. Something told me the dog's death hadn't been natural. Shortly after, the cat disappeared. At first, we thought it had just gone out for its usual wanderings in the streets. But a few days later, I found its rigid body thrown in a trash can. It seemed to have suffered a terrible death. The grotesque image filled me with revulsion and fed a growing fear. There was something behind all this, something that completely escaped my comprehension. I felt I was on the verge of madness. I desperately wanted to return to my home, but my parents couldn't receive me because of problems they were facing. Meanwhile, my aunt and uncle, previously serene, began to show restlessness. The events they had rationalized were becoming impossible to ignore. It was clear that something dark surrounded us, and fear now hovered over us like a constant shadow. The nights became unbearable. The silence was charged, filled with noises that made no sense, while the sensation of being watched never left me. The nightmares were so vivid that they seemed to crawl into the real world. Even trips to the grocery store had become torment. I knew that inevitably I would have to pass by the shelter where the indigent had died. Just thinking about it made my entire body tense. The image of his decomposing corpse haunted me in ways I couldn't explain. One day, trying to push these thoughts away, I heard two voices near the shelter. They were two men talking, one with a strong southern accent speaking about the man who had died there. He said that he wasn't a common homeless person, but a santero. He explained they had taken his life because he used dark practices to curse some residents of the neighborhood. Desperate from the misfortunes they faced, these men killed him and left his body there, as a kind of warning for anyone who dared resort to witchcraft. Hearing this, I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. Suddenly, everything seemed to make a terrible sense. The presence I felt at home, the deaths of the animals, it was all connected to that santero. His restless, vengeful spirit was now wandering the streets. Perhaps he sought revenge, or maybe he was just trapped in this world, unable to depart in peace. That night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking that the santero's spirit wasn't just wandering out there. He had found a way into our house. What I had felt before was probably just the beginning of something much more terrifying. After this discovery, the weight inside the apartment became unbearable. The darkness seemed denser, more present, as if it were a living entity that filled every space. It was as if everything around had been contaminated. The inexplicable cold that ran through the corridors, the shadows that moved too quickly, the sound of the wind, everything seemed to whisper that I wasn't alone. During the nights, this certainty consumed me. The fear was overwhelming. The sensation of being constantly watched was with me all the time, like a nightmare that never ended. My aunt and uncle also began to notice, although we never openly discussed it. It was obvious to all of us that there was something dark and cursed in that place. The nights were suffocating, the silence so dense it seemed to scream, occasionally broken by almost imperceptible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Until one early morning, the silence was broken in a terrifying way. I woke to the smell of smoke. In seconds, the apartment was enveloped in flames. Everything happened too quickly. My aunt, uncle, and I rushed out, fleeing from the fire that devoured everything in its path. The flames consumed the walls, the ceiling, our memories and accumulated lives. Everything reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. We didn't know how the fire had started, but I felt it was linked to that presence that tormented us. And it wasn't just us. Other building residents were also affected. When we reached the street, we looked helplessly at the burning building, watching the complete destruction. We could do nothing but observe as our lives turned to ashes. Alongside other families, we shared the same tragedy. Some managed to get temporary shelter, but many, including us, weren't so lucky. We were trapped in the same misery that already hovered over the neighborhood. With the little we managed to save, just clothes and sparse memories, we sheltered in an improvised tent. It protected us from the wind and rain, but didn't ward off the terror that continued to pursue me. The nights were unbearable. The cold ground, the sounds of the streets, and above all, the presence of the Santero's spirit that seemed never to leave me. I knew he was there, lurking, watching, and this knowledge consumed me. My dreams became torments. The decomposed face of the homeless man constantly appeared in the shadows of my nightmares, observing, approaching. One night, these nightmares invaded reality. I woke with my heart racing, covered in sweat, and saw him, the gray, rotting face of the Santero peering between the curtains of our tent. His deep, empty eyes seemed to fix directly on me, full of hatred and frightening malice. Fear hit me like a blade. I let out a desperate scream that cut through the night. In panic, I ran out, stumbling over the tent and my aunt and uncle who were trying to understand what was happening. I ran until my legs couldn't take it anymore, but the sensation that he was following me, always a few steps away, never abandoned me. Stories began to circulate among the people in the neighborhood. Reports of inexplicable tragedies gained strength. They spoke of disasters linked to the spirit of the homeless man. There were rumors of fatal accidents, mysterious illnesses, and irreparable losses, always involving those who crossed his path. With each new story, fear spread even more, and the presence of that spirit seemed to grow in power and influence. Every time I left the tent to get food or water, new reports reached my ears. People spoke of neighbors who suddenly saw the Santero's spirit, an apparition that clearly didn't belong to this world. Others described just the sensation of a dark, invisible presence, whose simple contact brought instant misfortunes. The braver ones claimed to have seen his rotting face in dreams or visions, always marked by an unbearable hatred and despair. With the little we had left, we were forced to leave the neighborhood. Departing was a painful and chaotic process, leaving behind everything we knew. We carried only fragile memories that seemed to crumble with each step. I returned to my parents' house with mixed feelings, relief to be far from that darkness, but sadness for all I had lost. They welcomed me with concern, relieved to see me back, but clearly impacted by the horrors I had faced. My aunt and uncle, on the other hand, didn't have the same luck. The fire, the evil presence, and poverty had reduced them to a situation of extreme misery. Everything they owned had been lost, and they ended up plunged into an even more severe indigence. After that summer, I never saw them again. This experience marked me deeply. The sensation of being watched by something so evil and heavy has stayed with me. Whenever I close my eyes, the Santero's face returns, along with the weight of his presence that I still feel around me, as if waiting to claim those who dared cross his path. This wound doesn't disappear, a permanent scar in my consciousness that reminds me there are things we cannot leave behind, no matter how much we try to escape. I promised I would never speak about this story again, because nobody gives any credit to what we experienced. Everything happened in the year 2018, during a period when I was institutionalized. It wasn't anything serious regarding physical health, but my routine involved drinking daily. Alcohol led me to do many terrible things, and my family reached their limit. They decided to commit me to a rehabilitation center that no longer exists in northern Pennsylvania. The night I arrived there, I didn't want to accept it. I resisted, but they insisted it was for my own good. Hours later, I realized I did indeed have a problem with alcohol, and perhaps really needed help. Deep down, I had thought about this before, but lacked the courage to admit it. That same night, one of the staff took me to the dormitory. Everyone was already in bed, sleeping. They arranged a bunk bed for me. The top bunk was mine, and below was another patient. They told me to sleep, and so I did. But at 5 a.m, they woke us all up. My roommate from the bottom bunk introduced himself early that morning. His name was Marcus. He had problems with very heavy drugs, and it was evident, extremely thin, missing teeth, and hunched over. Despite his difficult appearance, Marcus was uniquely gentle. Gradually, he became my greatest support in that place. He taught me how to do deep cleaning, to have discipline, and always reinforced that I shouldn't throw my life away with alcohol or any other substance. After group therapies, he continued talking with me, always with valuable advice. Marcus was admired by everyone there. He made a point of opening our eyes to the errors of the paths we were treading. I developed a great affection for him, and at the same time felt sad knowing he was about to leave, since he had completed his time at the center and was preparing to restart his life. Then came that night. It was about 2 a.m. when I felt him get up from the bed and go to the bathroom. I saw his silhouette moving away, but soon went back to sleep. At 5 a.m, when we were awakened, a patient who entered the bathroom found Marcus. He had hanged himself with a belt. To this day, no one knows how he got it, since items like that were prohibited. We tried to help him, taking him down, but it was too late. What was most shocking was the lack of explanation. Marcus seemed to be doing well and was so close to leaving. The psychologists also didn't understand what had led him to do that. From then on, the center was never the same. Days after his death, strange things began to happen, and I believe I was the first to witness one. One early morning, while everyone was sleeping, I suddenly woke up. Looking into the darkness, I saw the silhouette of a man walking toward the bunk bed. I thought it was a patient or some staff member, but when the moonlight illuminated his face, I immediately recognized him. It was Marcus, wearing the same clothes from the night he died. I was paralyzed, watching as he approached, but before reaching the bed, his figure dissolved as if swallowed by the shadow. Seconds later, I heard and felt the mattress below creaking, as if someone were lying on it. Even afraid, I looked down and saw him sitting, staring at the floor, motionless. I covered myself again, trying to convince myself it was some kind of joke. But when I found the courage to look again, he had already vanished. This happened 2 more times that same week. Marcus would appear in the dormitory, but I never told anyone, thinking they wouldn't believe me. Maybe I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. Once during a group therapy session, a young man who slept in the bed across from mine began to vent, saying he was on the verge of madness. He recounted that one night when he went to the bathroom, he saw Marcus standing in a corner, just looking at him in silence. That account triggered other testimonies. Some said they had heard footsteps during the early morning hours, while others swore they had heard Marcus calling them in his own voice. These supernatural situations always happened in the middle of the night. Despite the constant reports, the counselors, therapists, and those in charge of the center didn't believe us. They thought we were losing our minds, or that the treatment routine wasn't having an effect. Out of fear of being discredited or considered unstable, I preferred to remain silent. Not even my family knew what happened. However, every night I slept restlessly, fearing these events. It seemed that Marcus didn't realize he was no longer part of this world. Shortly after, I left the center and never again had contact with anyone from there. But I know the paranormal activity continued intensely after what happened. Marcus was my friend, someone for whom I had great appreciation. But the truth is that seeing someone who has departed is, at minimum, terrifying. What perplexed me most about the whole situation was the inexplicable nature of his suicide. Marcus had spent months enthusiastically planning his post-rehabilitation life. The day before he died, he had shown me pictures of the small apartment he had rented through a social worker's assistance program. He'd been excitedly talking about a job interview lined up for the following week. Years later, I returned to that town and learned something that chilled me to the bone. The center had been built on the grounds of an old asylum, where dozens of patients had died under mysterious circumstances in the 1950s. The room where Marcus and I stayed was directly above what had once been the morgue. Sometimes I wonder if it was really Marcus that night, or if something older and darker had found a way to wear his face. Either way, I still feel his presence occasionally, in the moment between sleeping and waking, when the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Good evening. I decided to tell you this because I know you enjoy stories that make you think. My house sits near a ravine, where strange things have been happening. They're not ghosts, but something different. I'm a college student, and because of that, I often end up working on my studies until late at night. During one of those early mornings, the clock marked 2 o'clock when I noticed that the house was in complete silence. The sound of my pencil scratching against paper was the only thing breaking the emptiness. Suddenly, that silence was interrupted. Laughter began to echo, many voices together with loud, and at the same time shrill tones. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking they could be neighbors, but the laughter grew louder. Curious, I went to the window. That's when I realized the sounds weren't coming from the street, but from the ravine. I looked carefully at that dark place, and on the edge, I saw small figures, tiny men wearing clothes made of rags. They were walking toward the bottom of the ravine. They must have been about 8 inches tall. It was at that moment that I remembered the stories the older neighbors used to tell about gnomes. I observed as they followed in a line, disappearing into the darkness. Some vanished as if they'd become invisible, while others descended through the underbrush until they hid among the plants. Incredibly, I didn't feel fear, only profound amazement. It was surprising to think that these creatures, considered merely legends, could be real. At that moment, it didn't even cross my mind to take a photo. I was so impressed that the camera seemed insignificant. Since then, I've never seen these figures again, but in the neighborhood, reports of similar encounters still circulate. One of these stories comes from an elderly man who lived around here in the 1980s, when the region was practically deserted. He built a simple wooden house for his family and had the habit of drinking on weekends. One Saturday, after leaving work, he went to the local bar. As it was getting dark, around 7 in the evening, he was heading home. When passing near the ravine, he heard several voices calling his name. The voices came from down below. Being brave, he decided to approach. There he saw several gnomes who grabbed him and pulled him to the bottom. Despite fighting, he couldn't break free as they were incredibly strong. He only remembers fainting. When he woke up, he was at the top of a tree in the ravine, with no understanding of how he had gotten there. He began to shout for his wife, who ran to him. With difficulty, he climbed down through the branches and returned home. When his wife asked what had happened, he said the gnomes had taken him as part of a prank. Another case is told by a neighbor lady. Her son, who is now 30 years old, was a child at the time. They lived in a house near the ravine, in an area with few buildings. One day, the boy was playing soccer with friends in the street. It was almost night when a ball was kicked hard and got stuck in the bushes at the edge of the ravine. Suddenly, a strange boy appeared from the bushes. He wore torn clothes and was barefoot. He picked up the ball and returned it to the boys, but said something curious. He offered a new and prettier ball on the condition that they all come down to the ravine. The boys hesitated. Their parents had been clear in forbidding them from approaching the ravine. Still, the strange boy insisted and was gradually convincing them. They were almost descending when the mother of one of them appeared at her door and shouted for him to come in immediately. The woman's call made everyone look in her direction, but when they turned their gaze back to the boy in tattered clothes, he had disappeared. The scene left everyone in panic. Screaming, they ran to their homes and told their parents what had happened. It wasn't long before the adults came to the same conclusion. The The gnomes had tried to take the children. They were one step away from following them. I've heard another tale from an older woman in the neighborhood. She claims that when she was a little girl, her grandmother told her about making a pact with the little people of the ravine. The deal was simple. She'd leave them small offerings of food, and in return, they'd help protect her garden from pests and disease. According to this woman, her grandmother's garden was always the most lush in the area, even during droughts. There's something else that's odd about the ravine. Modern surveying equipment often malfunctions there. A local construction company tried to develop the area a few years ago, but abandoned the project after experiencing technical difficulties they wouldn't elaborate on. One of the workers confidentially told me their GPS systems would show them in completely different locations whenever they entered the ravine area, and their electronic measuring tools would give wildly inconsistent readings. These stories were always commented on by my neighbors. At first, I didn't give them much importance and thought it was all a great invention. However, as I already said, that changed when I saw with my own eyes that it was real. What I haven't told anyone is that since that night, I've been leaving small gifts, bits of honey, shiny trinkets, and colorful threads at the edge of the ravine. I don't know if they're accepting my offerings, but sometimes in the morning, I find the items rearranged in patterns I don't understand. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe something more. Last week, I lost my house key while walking near the ravine. I searched everywhere but couldn't find it. The next morning, it was sitting on my windowsill, the one facing the ravine, with a small, perfectly braided cord attached to it, made from materials I've never seen before. I keep it with me now, a reminder that sometimes the line between legend and reality is thinner than we think. I'm going to share a story that I experienced about 12 years ago when I was admitted to a rehabilitation center around 2012. I was 18 years old and had just finished high school. At that point in my life, I was living with my father and had a habit of going from one party to another. To be honest, I studied at a school frequented by children from wealthy families, where I met several people who were already involved with certain substances. You know what I'm talking about. I came from a simple community, but I didn't care as long as I was accepted into that group, as I saw my classmates as more daring than myself. So when I finished high school, my parents made the decision for the first time to admit me to rehab. At that time, rehabilitation centers were precarious, and the place where I was sent was no different, especially because it had just opened. There were all kinds of people there, sailors, military personnel, people with complicated pasts, even criminals. When I arrived, I met a man they called the Witch. He had already been there for some time. They said he came from New Orleans, and when he was brought to the center, the staff found in his house a huge altar dedicated to a Santa Muerte. This fueled rumors that he actually practiced witchcraft. This man was a drug addict. He had a habit of smoking very potent substances and drinking beer. Despite this, he had already been institutionalized for some time. One night, I had to share the bunk bed with him. I imagined that, given the time he had been at the center, he was already recovered and, as he claimed, had become a man of God. However, there are things that escape our understanding. That night, we all went to sleep, and I had no problems with him in the lower part of the bunk bed, while I occupied the top. It's worth mentioning that the mattresses were still in plastic to prolong their durability. Around 11 or midnight, I fell asleep as usual, but woke up suddenly at 3 in the morning. It was at that moment that I heard the noise of the plastic mattress below, as if he was moving a lot. Since we had a certain coexistence, I thought about asking him to stop, but before that, I noticed that the environment had changed in a strange way. It was as if time had frozen. The atmosphere became heavy, and the walls, previously white, took on a purplish tone. In that dormitory, we were around 30 people, all already asleep, while he made noise in the early morning. I found it strange, but what came next was even more disturbing. He began to speak in Latin, without exaggeration, reciting a long prayer of about 20 verses without making a single mistake. The words that came out of his mouth were terrible, frightening, and I was seized by a deep dread. But the situation didn't end there. After stopping the recitation, that man went silent, and I, gripped by fear, tried to pray. But I couldn't even remember the entire Lord's Prayer. I could only desperately repeat, "Lord, help me, Father, please help me." I couldn't think of anything else. It was about 10 seconds since he had ceased the prayer, but soon he began to emit sounds like those of a dog. I heard and clearly felt the sound of a huge dog coming from under the bed. At that instant, I remembered that the man was from New Orleans, and the thought that he could lead me somewhere terrifying completely chilled me. The noise was frightening. It really sounded like a dog growling and barking, like a real animal. I don't know if he actually transformed or not, as I closed my eyes and didn't have the courage to look. The sensation was that no one else had noticed anything, but suddenly everything began to return to normal. Even so, I remained terrified, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. It was then that I heard, coming from the stairs of the center, the sound of a cat meowing, increasingly closer. The meow echoed through the space. Terrified by everything that had already happened, I knew I wouldn't be able to wake the others to tell them what had occurred. But the sound of the approaching cat wouldn't stop, and I could only think, please, don't let it climb on me. The last thing I saw was the cat getting closer and closer, still meowing. After that, I fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, I decided to confront the witch. I asked directly, "Wasn't it you who said you were a Christian?" With cynical tranquility, he replied, "Yes, I am a Christian, and I believe in God." I found that an affront and continued, "But I heard you speaking in another language last night." He, however, acted as if nothing had happened, completely ignoring my words and simply walking away. Still, our conversation caught the attention of another inpatient, known as Big Cal. He approached and said, "So you heard it too, didn't you?" I confirmed that yes, and commented that I had almost died of fear. He, surprised, insisted, "It was last night, wasn't it?" It wasn't the first time. Cal went on to tell me that he had been there longer and had witnessed similar episodes before, always involving the witch. He explained that most new patients were paired with him at some point. It was almost like a test or initiation. The staff knew about the incidents, but dismissed them as hallucinations or withdrawal symptoms. What disturbed me most was learning that several former patients who had shared a room with the witch had left the center only to commit suicide shortly afterward. Cal believed the man was placing curses on people while they slept, feeding on their vulnerability. I asked the rehabilitation center for a room change the next day, citing severe anxiety, but they refused. For the remaining 3 weeks of my stay, I barely slept, always keeping one eye open, watching for any movement from the bottom bunk. On my last night there, just before dawn, I woke to find the witch standing beside my bed, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He whispered something, not in Latin this time, but in a language I couldn't recognize. Then he smiled and returned to his bed. I left the center the following morning, but something had changed inside me. The drinking that had seemed so important before now held no appeal. In fact, I've been sober ever since that day. Sometimes I wonder if that was his purpose all along, to scare people straight, not through therapy, but through terror. Now I ask you, was that witch a sorcerer? Did he transform that night, or was it something else? I want to know your opinion. If this had happened years ago, I might have avoided saying my name while sharing this story. But that doesn't make a difference now, since I no longer work at that pharmacy. Yes, that one where we used white doctor-like coats for promotions. The truth is, I didn't leave on bad terms. It was an excellent job for me. I worked there between 2016 and 2018 at a pharmacy located in Greenville, South Carolina, in a shopping district near Haywood Mall. During my first 10 months, we rarely saw the colleague responsible for wearing the mascot costume. He would appear occasionally, sometimes every week or even every 15 days, to dance and attract customers. It wasn't something common in our branch. I mention this because after 10 months, although this guy was only seen occasionally, the costume always remained stored in a corner, protected by a dark cover. This back room was exclusive for staff, and during that period, it was just me and an older colleague, a woman in her mid-30s during the morning shift. One day, we opened the store as usual. The morning was passing quietly, and my colleague and I were chatting about our families, just killing time. She got up to attend to a customer, and I continued on the computer, adjusting inventory and resolving pending issues. That's when, from the corner of my eye, I noticed a movement. That covered costume on the floor seemed to have moved. I looked directly at it, thinking perhaps it was falling, though its structure made that unlikely. But it didn't fall, it remained in place. For a moment, I thought it might have been the wind moving the cover, or maybe a mistake on my part. My colleague then called me, asking about a medication that hadn't arrived. I helped her look to see if we had anything forgotten around, but we didn't find anything. We directed the customer to another nearby pharmacy, and when we returned to the counter, we both clearly saw through the shelves the costume standing upright, even though it was still covered by the cloth. We were paralyzed. The next instant, it fell back to the floor as if carefully placed where it was before. My visibly nervous colleague mentioned the name of the guy who wore the costume, as if wanting him to stop that joke. She approached to lift the cover and check. When she raised the lower part of the costume, there was no one inside. She looked at me with wide eyes and let the costume fall. We immediately left the pharmacy. Outside, we exchanged questions about what we had just witnessed. Both of us confirmed we had seen the same thing, and tried to understand what might have happened. We knew our colleague hadn't appeared for days, and we too had opened the pharmacy that morning. It made no sense for someone to have put on the costume, stood up, and then disappeared. We spent the rest of the shift unsettled, attentive to every movement, always casting suspicious glances at that outfit. It was the only time in 2 years that something like this happened. The guy stopped working with the costume some time later, and a new colleague took over his function. Sometimes the costume was sent for cleaning, but we never knew for sure if the one that returned was the same. Perhaps it was another, or perhaps somehow that one had never been just a costume. The strangest part was when I told our manager about the incident a few days later. Instead of looking surprised or dismissive, he got very quiet. After a long pause, he told me something I hadn't known. The pharmacy chain had initially considered using animatronic mascots rather than costumes with people inside. They had ordered a prototype from a robotics company for our location to test. But after some technical issues, they switched to traditional costumes. He wouldn't elaborate on what those technical issues were, but he did ask me to report if I ever saw anything unusual again. He also mentioned that the previous employee who wore the costume had quit suddenly, refusing to ever put it on again after claiming he had felt it move on its own while he was wearing it. The day after our experience, something else happened that I never told anyone. I was closing up the store alone when I heard music coming from the back room. A tinny, music box version of a commercial jingle our pharmacy had used years before. When I went to investigate, the music stopped. The costume lay on the floor exactly as we had left it, but sitting next to it was a small toy pharmacy counter, meticulously crafted from what looked like popsicle sticks and cardboard, with tiny bottles made from rolled paper. I don't know who made it or how it got there. I threw it away immediately and requested a transfer to another branch the following week. I never went back to that location again, but sometimes when I drive past it at night, I swear I can see someone in a white coat standing in the window, watching the street long after closing time. Before completing my undergraduate degree, I spent a year working at one of the pharmacy branches in my town in rural Washington state. One night, while we were only attending through the service window, something strange happened. It was just my coworker Ethan and I on shift. He was in the back of the pharmacy, engrossed with videos on his phone, while I was changing the filters on the coffee machines. Suddenly, in the corridor behind the machine, I saw something that looked like a child's head passing quickly toward the back. I immediately stopped what I was doing. The entrance door was locked. I had closed it myself half an hour before, and there were no children around. I entered the corridor to investigate, and looking toward the back, I saw my colleague standing behind the counter with a fixed stare. He asked, "Did you hear that too?" I replied yes, and said I had seen a child running toward the back. At that moment, both of us heard the hurried footsteps. He left the counter and began walking through the corridors calling out, "Hey, kid, where are you?" Meanwhile, I went to check the entrance to confirm if someone had managed to open the door, but it remained locked. We searched the entire pharmacy, in the corridors, behind the shelves, even in the refrigerators. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone there, and the emergency exit was also closed, as always. We returned to the counter, and my colleague spoke seriously. "It's better to leave this alone. What you saw and what I heard wasn't a child. I've heard small footsteps before, but you know what they say, they're not children. Let's keep quiet, make the sign of the cross, and focus on something else. If we keep looking, we might end up finding it." After checking all the doors again, I agreed. Despite the fear that came over me, I knew he was right. If it had really been a real child, the colleagues who monitored the cameras would have warned us. However, no one mentioned anything. We weren't reprimanded for anything they might have seen in the images. Until the end of the time I spent working the night shift, that episode never left my head. I always feared that child might reappear. Fortunately, that never happened again. But last month, I ran into Ethan at a coffee shop across town. It had been 3 years since I'd seen him, and naturally, we caught up on life. When I mentioned the incident with the phantom child, his face went pale. "I never told you this," he said, leaning in close, "but that wasn't the first time it happened." He explained that he'd been working at that pharmacy for nearly 7 years, and the child had appeared multiple times, but only during night shifts. Most employees who witnessed it eventually requested transfers or quit. "There's a reason they put the night shift job listing up every few months," he said grimly. According to Ethan, the building had once been a small family medical practice back in the 1940s. A young boy had died during a routine tonsillectomy when the doctor accidentally administered too much anesthesia. The family sued the practice, which eventually closed, but rumors persisted that the child's spirit remained. "The weird thing is," Ethan continued, "about a week after we saw the child, I was reviewing the security footage for a suspected shoplifting incident. I was scrubbing through the recording from our shift, and I noticed something odd." He described how at exactly 2:17 a.m., around the time we had our experience, there was a brief moment where the cameras seemed to glitch. The timestamp jumped forward 3 minutes, and when the recording resumed, both Ethan and I were in different positions than we had been moments before. "It's like those 3 minutes just disappeared," he said, "and the pharmacy manager forbids anyone from discussing it. When new hires report seeing the child, they're told it's just sleep deprivation or their imagination. But we all know better." I asked him why he still worked there after all these years. "Someone needs to keep an eye out for that kid," he replied. "Sometimes I think he's just lost and looking for help." Other times, he didn't finish the sentence. Before we parted ways, Ethan told me one last thing. The previous month, they'd started renovating the pharmacy's back storage room. Behind one of the old walls, construction workers found a small, worn teddy bear and a child's shoe, estimated to be from the 1940s. The items were removed, but the phantom child sightings reportedly increased tenfold afterward. "Just be glad you don't work nights anymore," were his parting words to me. My name is Catherine, and many years ago, when I was 26, I worked for a short period at a pharmacy in Roanoke, Virginia, located on Jefferson Street. I ended up leaving the job because we moved to Richmond, and the distance became impractical. At that time, the place was known as Jefferson Pharmacy, though today it has become a unit of a large chain that begins with the letter W. Curiously, the pharmacy sign is visibly worn, with a soaked or singed appearance, giving it a dark and almost abandoned look. During my time there, I worked the afternoon to evening shift, ending around 9 or 10 at night, depending on the day. Sometimes, even after closing, I would remain inside, finishing up tasks. On one of these nights, I stayed alone because my colleague, let's call her Elaine, a woman in her 40s, left early to address a dental problem. Her appointment was scheduled for 8 o'clock, so that day she was released before closing time. When I finished arranging my things, with everything closed up, I noticed something strange. My father was already waiting for me outside, but when I looked toward the back of the pharmacy, I saw Elaine standing there, bent over as if choosing something in the area where the bread was kept, near the entrance. I found it odd because she had left hours before, yet there she was, still wearing her work lab coat. Not understanding, I gathered my things and began approaching her, asking why she had returned. As I was addressing her, I saw Elaine walk toward the exit. I followed, but she disappeared upon turning toward the metal doors that were closed and locked. I didn't even hear the noise those doors make when being opened. I went out and asked my father if he had seen Elaine leave. He, who was parked right in front of the pharmacy, stated that he hadn't. He said that besides me, no one had passed by there. Given my insistence, he tried to reassure me, suggesting that perhaps I was tired or imagining things. Even so, I insisted, calling for Elaine back into the pharmacy. The silence as a response only reinforced the discomfort. I admit I was frightened, but there wasn't much I could do. I moved on and tried to forget the episode. The next day, upon reuniting with Elaine, we talked about her appointment, and then I mentioned what had happened the previous night. Her reaction was unexpected. Instead of showing curiosity or asking for details, she quickly changed the subject, saying that I had probably been confused, exactly as my father had said. This response made me question the occurrence, although to this day, I can't help but think about the strangeness of that night. 2 days after the incident, it was Elaine's day off, and since the pharmacy didn't have enough staff, I ended up staying alone to attend to everything. That night, when closing, I followed the same procedure. I lowered the metal shutters and stayed inside organizing some things while waiting for my father. When I heard the horn of his car, I got up from the chair, and to my surprise, Elaine was standing near the door, watching me. But there was something strange. The way she looked at me was totally different from what I knew. The light in that area was off, but it was still possible to see her clearly. Her face was expressionless, which made me uncomfortable, even scared. I responded reflexively that she had scared me and that I hadn't heard her come in, although I knew that was impossible. The metal shutter was lowered, and the noise to raise it would be unmistakable. Elaine didn't respond at all. She just raised her hand and made a gesture for me to follow her. She began walking to the right and disappeared from view. Driven by instinct, I grabbed my things and followed along the left side of the pharmacy, avoiding the center. I quickly raised the door, went out, closed it again, and began locking it with the padlock. My father noticed my haste, got out of the car, and asked if I had been frightened again. I replied yes, that I had seen Elaine, but that I knew it wasn't really her. Trying to calm me down, he took me to buy a soda, and asked what I intended to do: talk to the manager, request a transfer. I didn't know how to act or what to think. The next day, which was my day off, I couldn't rest well. When I returned to work, still shaken, I told everything to Elaine. It was then that she revealed something disturbing. Episodes like the one I experienced weren't uncommon. It's not the first time this has happened, Catherine. Especially with those who pay attention to who is or should be here at closing time, Elaine said, and continued with an even more serious tone. You know what it is. It's the floor above. Have you seen that it's now unoccupied? Well, she recounted that there was a time when the space was rented for businesses. One of the tenants did horrible things up there. Things of witchcraft, works for evil. He stayed for a short time, but since he left, these strange things started happening around here. Not even holy water or crucifixes help. The problem isn't down here, it's up there. Elaine explained that the upper floor had a history of various uses, and that the owner of the pharmacy seemed to turn a blind eye to what happened up there. Why exactly, she didn't know either. After that, I didn't stay at that job for long. Even waiting for my father outside, I felt afraid just approaching the pharmacy at closing time. Elaine also told me about other episodes where she or colleagues had also been frightened. This was recurrent and reinforced the sensation that something truly strange hovered over the place. What disturbed me most was what she told me after our shift one night, speaking in hushed tones as we walked to our cars. Catherine, there's something else I haven't told you about the upstairs, she whispered. Before it was rented out to various businesses, it was a doctor's office in the 1930s. A young doctor named Mills practiced there, specialized in alternative treatments that weren't exactly proved. According to county records Elaine had found in the library archives, several patients died under mysterious circumstances while under Dr. Mills' care. The deaths were officially ruled as natural, but rumors spread that the doctor was conducting experiments mixing medicine with occult practices. The witchcraft tenant wasn't the first dark presence in that building, she continued. He was drawn to it because of what had happened before. Some say he was trying to contact the spirits of those who died upstairs. One night, about a week later, I was closing alone again. I had finished counting the register and was just about to turn off the lights when I heard a voice call my name from the storage room. It sounded exactly like Elaine, but with a hollow quality that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Catherine, can you help me with something back here? I knew Elaine wasn't working that night. I should have left immediately, but something compelled me to walk toward the voice. As I approached the storage room, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in the air, despite it being summer in Virginia. When I reached the doorway, I saw a figure that looked like Elaine, but not quite. She stood with her back to me, wearing our white pharmacy coat. But something was wrong. The edges of her form seemed to blur and shift, as if she wasn't fully solid. Elaine, I whispered. The figure turned, and what I saw wasn't Elaine at all. It was a face I didn't recognize, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pull at something inside me. The mouth opened wider than humanly possible, revealing nothing but darkness within. I ran. I didn't even bother to close up properly. I just grabbed my purse and fled, practically falling into my father's car outside. I called the manager that night and quit over the phone. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside that building, not even to collect my final paycheck. They mailed it to me instead. Years later, I was back in Roanoke visiting family and drove past the pharmacy. It was under new ownership by then, part of the larger chain. I noticed a construction crew working on the upper floor, which had been vacant for so long. Curiosity got the better of me, and I parked across the street to watch. One of the workers came down carrying what looked like an old leather-bound book and some glass vials. He spoke briefly with his supervisor, who immediately made a phone call. Within minutes, a black SUV with government plates arrived, and men in suits took the items away. That night, the pharmacy caught fire. The official report claimed faulty wiring, but locals whispered about strange blue flames and screams that didn't sound human. When they rebuilt, they sealed off the upper floor completely. The windows were bricked over, and access to any stairs removed. The pharmacy chain keeps staff rotation high at that location. No one works there longer than 6 months. And if you drive by at night and look carefully at the second-floor windows, the ones that shouldn't exist anymore, sometimes you can see a faint light moving behind the bricks, as if someone is still up there, pacing with a lantern, waiting for the next curious soul to answer when they call. Looking back on pivotal moments that change everything, it's difficult to imagine how certain choices can lead us down paths we never anticipated. What I'm about to share is about exactly that: choices, consequences, and how sometimes the unexpected can haunt us in ways we never imagined. My name is Eliza Morgan, and sharing my story isn't something I take pride in, but I feel it's necessary, perhaps as a warning to others. Recalling how it all began isn't simple, but I know the starting point was a choice: becoming a high-end escort, a woman of the night. My journey wasn't always like this. I spent my childhood in a rundown neighborhood in Chicago, raised by my grandmother. My mother had disappeared years ago, and my father, if I ever truly had the chance to know him, was merely a sporadic figure who showed up to ask for money or bring problems. My grandmother was my only anchor, and with the little we had, we tried to survive. But the nights when we went to bed hungry were far more frequent than I care to remember. Even amid the hardships, I excelled in school. Books were my escape, my way of fleeing the harsh reality we faced. I dreamed of becoming someone, of escaping poverty, of giving my grandmother a dignified life. When I finished high school, these dreams seemed closer. I earned a scholarship to university. The day I received the acceptance letter was a milestone. My grandmother cried with joy. It was our chance, the beginning of something better. However, university life brought greater challenges than I had imagined. Although I loved studying, the costs of maintaining myself and caring for my grandmother became an almost unbearable burden. I took simple jobs to help, but it was never enough. Several times, I considered dropping everything, abandoning my studies, and looking for a full-time job, even if it meant perpetuating a life of scarcity. That's when I met her. It was late, and I was working as a waitress in a rundown diner on the South Side. A woman walked in, about 35, dressed elegantly, with a confident air that contrasted completely with the place. While serving her table, I couldn't help but wonder what someone like her was doing there. When I brought her drink, she looked at me and said, as if reading my thoughts, "You don't belong in this place." I was speechless. Before I could say anything, she continued, "There are much easier ways to make money without so much effort." Her voice was calm, almost like a secret. "If you want to know more, I can help you." She left a card on the table. It simply said Victoria and a phone number. She smiled enigmatically and left, leaving me standing there motionless, with the card in my hand and an avalanche of thoughts in my mind. That night I couldn't sleep. Something inside me knew that by calling that number, I would be crossing a boundary I couldn't erase. Fear consumed me, but desperation was even greater. After weeks of indecision, I finally dialed Victoria's number. What she presented was an entrance into the world of high-end prostitution, something I had never considered, but which, at that moment, seemed like a solution to all my dilemmas. Victoria instructed me in every detail necessary to become a luxury escort. It wasn't just about being available. One needed to master posture, know how to dress, act with discretion, and above all, place value on the service offered. At first, the idea of selling my body made me feel disgusted. But upon seeing how much I could earn, that sensation quickly gave way to practical acceptance. My first client was Richard, a 55-year-old businessman who had met Victoria at one of her events. While getting ready for the encounter, I felt growing nervousness, but Victoria assured me everything would go well. He took me to a sophisticated restaurant downtown, and after dinner, suggested we go to a hotel. That night was strange. I felt displaced, as if I wasn't myself. Everything Victoria had taught me seemed to have evaporated, and I simply followed what Richard expected. When it was over, he left a considerable amount on the hotel room table and departed. I sat there on the bed, looking at the money, divided between a feeling of achievement and a bitter taste of regret. This experience marked the beginning of a double life. During the day, I was the dedicated university student, as always. My grandmother knew nothing about my new way of earning money, and I preferred to keep it that way. At night, however, my reality was different. I entertained wealthy and influential men, dined in expensive places, and slept in luxurious hotels. The money started coming easily, and soon I was able to move my grandmother and me to a more comfortable apartment. My life was better, but at a cost I didn't yet fully understand. As time passed, clients accumulated. Some sought more than just physical pleasure. They wanted someone to talk to, someone who would listen. Others, however, were interested only in immediate satisfaction and paid very well for it. I learned to interpret men, to understand what they desired without them having to say it, and to use this to my advantage. It was in this scenario that I met Marcus. He didn't resemble my other clients. When I first met him, he was 24, just 2 years older than me. He didn't have the confidence or superior air of the older men who usually sought me out. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable, out of place. When we met at the hotel, his eyes betrayed evident nervousness, and he said, "It's my first time doing this." I smiled gently, trying to reassure him. I was used to dealing with nervous men. But there was something about Marcus that bothered me. He was young, even attractive, but something in his gaze awakened a discomfort I couldn't ignore. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of his nervousness. During the night, he seemed distracted, as if his mind was far away. When everything was over and I was preparing to leave, he made an unexpected request. "Can I keep something of yours?" he asked, almost in a whisper, with a shyness that caught me by surprise. The request caught me off guard. Although some clients asked for small mementos or personal items, no one had been so direct. "What do you want?" I asked, feeling growing discomfort. "Your underwear," Marcus replied quickly, avoiding looking into my eyes. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The request was strange, but not the most unusual I had received. Without thinking much, I gave him the garment. He thanked me with a tense smile and left, leaving me alone in the hotel with a disconcerting sensation I couldn't explain. Marcus contacted me again shortly after, asking to meet again. Despite an instinct warning me against it, I accepted. During our subsequent meetings, he became increasingly bold, asking me to leave something of mine for him. At first, I didn't give it much importance. It was just a piece of clothing that could hardly cause harm. But then things started to change. After the first few encounters, something strange took over my home routine. I began to feel a constant presence. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of the apartment, just enough to catch my attention. I frequently had the sensation of being watched, even when alone. I tried to ignore it, blaming accumulated fatigue and stress. But the sensation persisted, becoming stronger each night. And most disturbing of all, it always seemed to get worse after seeing Marcus. I decided I needed to understand what was happening. It was clear to me something was wrong, and somehow Marcus was involved. Over time, I realized the unease wasn't just coming from Marcus's peculiarities, the way he insisted on taking something of mine after each encounter, but also from a darkness that seemed to settle around me. The nights in my apartment became unbearable. I barely slept, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, appearing to become denser and more threatening with each encounter with Marcus. The sensation of being watched became more suffocating. My grandmother, always perceptive, began to notice my state of mind. "Are you all right, my dear?" she asked one night as we dined. Her voice was soft but carried concern. "I'm fine, Grandma. Just a lot of work." "I'm stressed," I replied, forcing a smile. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't admit that every time I returned home after seeing Marcus, I felt a presence in my room, something or someone hidden in the shadows, watching me. It wasn't rational, but it was real to me. The nights grew longer and more terrifying. I would wake up several times feeling I wasn't alone. Whenever I turned on the light, however, the room was empty. Then on one of these nights, just after an encounter with Marcus, the fear reached its limit. I woke suddenly, with my body freezing cold. The air in the room was dense, suffocating, and the sensation of being watched was almost palpable. Hesitantly, I slowly opened my eyes. In the corner of the room, motionless, was a dark figure, like a shadow that had taken form. It wasn't doing anything, just staring at me, and that was enough to paralyze me with fear. I tried to move, but my body didn't respond. Completely paralyzed, my heart raced as the figure slowly advanced in my direction, as if feeding on my fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my throat. when that shadow was just a few centimeters from me, close enough to feel its suffocating presence. It simply vanished, just like that, without warning or explanation. I jumped out of bed, breathless, with my body drenched in sweat. I turned on all the lights in the apartment, trying to convince myself I was safe, but the dread wouldn't pass. What I had seen was real. I knew it wasn't a delusion or an illusion. The next morning, I understood I couldn't continue ignoring what was happening. Marcus had to be involved. I needed to confront him, demand answers. We met at one of the luxury hotels we frequently visited. As soon as I saw him, something seemed different. Marcus was thinner, with deep circles under his eyes and a haggard, almost haunted countenance. His physical state caused a tightness in my chest, and a sensation of anticipation took over me. Without beating around the bush, I went straight to the point. "What's happening, Marcus?" I asked, my voice heavy with tension. "Since I started meeting you, something follows me. I feel there's a dark presence in my life, and I know it has to do with you." He lowered his eyes, visibly uncomfortable. He nervously fidgeted with his hands, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear. After a few seconds, he spoke with hesitation. I did something I shouldn't have." My heart froze. "What did you do?" I pressed, trying to contain the growing fear threatening to take over me. Marcus finally raised his eyes and with a guilty expression responded, "I went to a woman. She said she could help me ensure you wouldn't leave me. I just wanted you to keep coming back, but I didn't know what I was unleashing." His words fell like a stone on me. Witchcraft, sorcery, the missing piece in the puzzle began to fit. The shadows, the sensation of being watched, the strange events in my house. Marcus had cast a spell, some kind of binding, and it had brought something much darker than he could control. "What kind of spell?" I asked, trying to keep my voice firm. "A binding," he admitted, almost without strength. "The woman said it would make you stay with me, but it summoned something, an entity." My mind was spinning, trying to assimilate what he had just confessed. Marcus, in his obsession, had summoned an unknown force, and now we were both trapped in its consequences. Worse still, he didn't seem to have any idea how to deal with what he had provoked. "And now," I asked, my voice laden with desperation. For this, Marcus had no answer. He just looked at me, his face pale and helpless, like someone who had awakened a nightmare he could no longer control. Marcus shook his head, and what I saw in his gaze paralyzed me. He was lost, not knowing how to deal with the forces he had unleashed. "I don't know how to stop it," he admitted in a whisper. "The witch warned me that breaking the bond would be very difficult. She said once called, the spirit would feed on our energies, on our emotions." A shiver ran up my spine. The realization that I was trapped in a dark cycle was overwhelming. Worse still, each encounter with Marcus seemed to strengthen this entity. I needed to act quickly before this malevolent presence completely consumed my life. That night, sleep was impossible. Marcus's words echoed in my mind. "It feeds on our energies." I knew continuing to see Marcus would only worsen the situation, but escaping what he had caused seemed equally impossible. I needed help to break this obscure bond. I remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell in my childhood, stories of spirits and witchcraft that I had always considered merely legends to scare children. Now these memories took on a different weight. Perhaps there was truth in them. The next day, I sought out my grandmother. I didn't tell her everything. My mind still couldn't bear saying the complete words. But I insinuated that something dark was circling my life, and asked for her help to find someone who understood witchcraft and could undo what Marcus had done. She looked at me with concern, but after a moment of silence, nodded. "I know someone," she said. "A woman named Helena. She's a healer. She's helped people in similar situations." My heart accelerated with a spark of hope. Perhaps this woman could free me from the darkness that was haunting me. That afternoon, my grandmother took me to Helena. Her house was on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by ancient trees and a garden full of herbs and medicinal plants. As soon as I crossed the door, I noticed something different. The air seemed denser, charged with an energy that was almost palpable. Helena was an elderly woman with gray hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to see beyond the visible. She observed me in silence for a moment, as if she could sense the presence that was haunting me. "Your grandmother told me a bit about what you're facing," she said as she made us sit at a table surrounded by lit candles. "I can feel that something dark is beside you, but it's not just a shadow. What follows you is an entity, an ancient and voracious spirit that feeds on you." Her words were a blow of reality. I already knew something was wrong, but hearing Helena confirm it with such conviction made everything seem even more frightening. I explained to her what Marcus had done, the binding spell, his obsession, and how it had brought the malevolent presence into my life. Helena listened calmly, slowly nodding as she processed each detail. "The binding wasn't just a simple spell," explained Helena. "It invoked something much more powerful, something that is now deeply linked to you." I remained silent, feeling my heart race. "Is it possible to break this?" I asked with urgency in my voice. "Yes," Helena responded firmly. "But it won't be easy. A ritual will be necessary to break the bond that this entity has created with you. And Marcus must be present. He is the key because he was the one who called it." The idea of facing him again left me uneasy. This time it wouldn't just be a conversation. We were about to confront a much greater force that wouldn't release us easily. Helena had been clear. The ritual would not only confront the entity, but also our own fears, and without Marcus, there was no way to break the bond. Contacting Marcus was difficult. I hesitated to see him again, feeling repulsion and fear at being near him. But Helena insisted. We had no other alternative. After much reluctance, he agreed to join us. When he arrived at Helena's house, Marcus looked even more debilitated than before. His face was pale, the dark circles deeper, and his expression revealed a terrifying exhaustion. He appeared drained, as if the entity was rapidly consuming him. Upon seeing him, a mixture of anger and pity took over me. He had caused all this with his irresponsibility, but it was evident that he was also being devoured by the same force. Helena received us with a serious expression. "We'll begin the ritual tonight," she announced as she lit candles around the room. "But you must be prepared. The entity won't give up without resisting. It's an ancient force, deeply connected to you. You will face your greatest fears." Those words chilled me. I knew it would be dangerous, but there was no choice. I couldn't continue living under the shadow of that presence, and neither could Marcus. We needed to end it. When night fell, Helena began to prepare the space. The small room was filled with a strong aroma of incense and burning herbs. We sat in a circle around an improvised altar, decorated with ancient objects and symbols I didn't recognize, but which seemed to carry meaning. The environment became heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air was impregnated with an oppressive energy. "We need to invoke the entity and confront it directly," explained Helena. "But before that, it's necessary for the bond between you to fully manifest. Only then can we break it." I didn't completely understand what this meant, but I trusted Helena. She had helped others in similar situations, and if anyone could save us from the darkness that enveloped us, it was her. Marcus was visibly trembling. His shoulders were tense, and he could barely stand. The nervousness was almost palpable, but we knew there was no turning back. Helena began to murmur words in a strange language, unknown to me. Her voice echoed through the room, carrying a powerful energy. The candles around us flickered as if touched by an invisible breeze, and the air grew colder, heavier. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, moving in a disturbing way. Suddenly, Helena raised her voice, firm and authoritative. "Spirit that was called, manifest yourself. The bond will be broken tonight." A chill ran through my body. Suddenly, I felt a suffocating pressure in my chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. My breath disappeared. The flames of the candles began to flicker uncontrollably. And then before us, it appeared. The figure I had seen before emerged in the center of the circle. It was tall, with an almost human form, but composed entirely of shadows. Its eyes glowed with an intense red, radiating hatred, and its presence dominated the environment with a suffocating terror. My body began to tremble. It felt like all energy was being drained from me, as if that being was feeding on my fear. Marcus gasped beside me. He stumbled, instinctively backing away. His face was contorted with terror as he stared at the entity without being able to look away. "This is the entity you invoked, Marcus," said Helena, with a calm but resolute tone. "Now we need to break the bond it has created with you." The figure advanced in our direction, slow but imposing. The weight in my chest increased. My hands trembled uncontrollably. Fear seemed to dominate every cell of my body, while the entity strengthened, absorbing my anguish. Helena fixed me with an intense gaze and said firmly, "Eliza, you need to confront it. Don't let fear control you. This entity depends on your emotions to survive. It has no power over you unless you allow it." Her words sounded like an instant echo in my mind. The overwhelming presence of the entity made it seem impossible to react. It was as if the air had disappeared from the room, and for an instant, I thought I wouldn't be able to resist. But from somewhere inside me, I gathered enough strength to stand up. "You don't own me," I shouted with every piece of courage I still had. "You can't control me." The entity stopped, hesitating. It seemed surprised, as if it hadn't expected resistance. For the first time, I felt a spark of hope ignite within me. Helena seized the moment. She threw more herbs onto the fire on the altar, making the circle glow intensely. The light illuminated the environment with an almost tangible force. Marcus, however, was in his own struggle. He fell to his knees, hands holding his head, groaning in pain. The entity seemed to be drawing him in, as if trying to devour him completely. "Marcus, you need to resist," shouted Helena, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This thing feeds on your fear. Don't let it win." Helena's words seemed to cut through Marcus's torment. Even fighting against the evident pain, he tried to rise. The entity kept its focus on him, which made sense. After all, it had been he who brought it into this world. Helena's chants gained intensity, and the atmosphere began to change. The oppressive weight in the air began to dissipate, and the flames on the altar grew in vigor. The entity let out a penetrating hiss, as if the fire was wounding it. It wavered, retreating slightly, but it still resisted. "The bond will be broken tonight," declared Helena, her voice full of authority. A guttural roar echoed through the room, and time seemed to freeze. A wave of energy swept the environment, almost like an invisible barrier being broken. Suddenly, all the lights went out, plunging us into total darkness. For an instant, absolute silence dominated. Then the candles began to glow again, and the shadowy figure had disappeared. I collapsed, exhausted. My body trembled with relief and wear, but I knew we had succeeded. Helena breathed deeply, appearing equally exhausted. Marcus was fallen, crying softly, but he was alive. The ritual had worked. The bond with the entity had been broken. Still, the marks left by its presence seemed irreversible, like wounds that would take a long time to heal. After a moment of recovery, Helena approached us. Her gaze was heavy, grave. Even with the success of the ritual, something in her expression left me uncomfortable. "The bond has been broken," she said with a somber calm. "But you need to understand, this entity was not destroyed. It's out there, lurking, waiting for an opportunity to return. You must always be vigilant." My stomach turned. Her words brought a bitter truth. We had won that battle, but the war against that darkness wasn't over yet. The entity was free, without restraints, but it remained a latent threat. Upon returning home that night, a mixture of relief and apprehension took over me. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, but I knew I couldn't relax. The shadow of what we faced still hovered somewhere, invisible but present. I made a firm decision to cut all ties with Marcus. I couldn't risk our proximity being a breach for the entity's return. Although it was a painful choice, I knew it was best for both of us. The bond he created had dragged us into an abyss, and maintaining any kind of relationship would only prolong the risks. In the weeks that followed, a strange calm took over me. The physical presence of the entity had disappeared, but the memories of what happened remained like scars engraved on the soul. The fear was no longer palpable, but it had transformed into a constant reminder of how the barriers between our world and the unknown can be dangerously fragile. I never returned to Helena's house, but her advice and the experience of that night stayed with me. The shadows I faced didn't completely disappear. They were there, buried in memory, ready to remind me of what was possible in the darkness. The day after, I made a definitive decision. I cut all contact with Marcus. I realized that maintaining any bond with him was risking our lives again. I didn't want anything that connected me to that darkness. Despite feeling a mixture of pity and relief upon leaving him behind, I knew this was the only sensible choice. Marcus was not only the cause of the nightmare we lived, but also a victim trapped in his own despair. I tried to resume my life as if nothing had happened, but this proved impossible. In the weeks following the ritual, the sensation of danger still hovered over me. The nights were no longer disturbed by shadowy presences or movements in the shadows, but something profound had changed within me. My perception of reality had distorted, and now I knew that evil could take forms I had never imagined. Returning to my work as a luxury escort was strange. I still needed the money to support my grandmother and maintain the lifestyle I had built. But the world that before seemed full of excitement and control now seemed empty, even insignificant. In each encounter with a client, my mind wandered back to the entity, to what I had experienced, and to the terror that had marked me. The shine of luxury had lost all its fascination. The clients noticed my change. Some commented that I seemed more distant, more reserved. Despite trying to keep up appearances, I felt that something inside me had broken. The money that was once a source of comfort and security now seemed worthless. The control I used to feel when dealing with my clients lost all importance. My grandmother, always sensitive to my emotions, quickly noticed my change. I never told her all the details about Marcus or the entity, but she knew something heavy was disturbing me. One afternoon while cooking, she looked at me firmly and said, "Child, I feel you're carrying an enormous burden. You don't need to tell me, but I want you to know I'm here for you." Her words, full of love and understanding, brought tears to my eyes. I couldn't share everything, but knowing she was by my side gave me comfort I hadn't felt in weeks. For her, I decided I needed to try to move forward. I needed to find a way to leave behind what happened, even knowing I would never be able to completely forget. The fear continued there, hidden like a shadow lurking. As the months passed, the emotional scars began to soften, but the echoes of that darkness still persisted. Sometimes I would wake from disturbing dreams, where the shadows returned to haunt me. I always saw the entity in the distance, watching, as if waiting for the right moment to return. I would wake in a cold sweat, but upon opening my eyes, everything seemed normal. Even so, the sensation of being watched never completely disappeared. After a month of trying to deal with the weight of this experience alone, I decided to visit Helena again. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for in returning, but I felt I needed some kind of closure, something that would help me understand what happened and give me strength to move forward. When I arrived at Helena's house, she received me with the serenity she always demonstrated. I sat in front of her and shared about the dreams that continued to haunt me and the sensation that the darkness still hovered nearby, as if waiting for a breach. Helena listened to everything in silence, only nodding occasionally. When I finished, she gave me a calm but firm look and said, "The evil you face doesn't completely disappear, Eliza. This entity was expelled, but it left a mark on you. The important thing now is to prevent that mark from growing. You must move forward, but with caution, protecting yourself from the energies that may try to return." Her words, although harsh, brought a certain comfort. I knew I could never forget what I had experienced, but I understood that I had the power to keep that darkness away. Helena suggested a final spiritual cleansing, something that would help close that chapter and reinforce my protection. I accepted immediately. The cleansing ritual was simpler than what we had performed to break the bond with the entity, but no less powerful. While Helena recited her prayers and burned herbs around me, I felt a slight tranquility settling in for the first time in a long time. My mind was at peace. The shadows didn't lurk, the whispers disappeared. There was only the sound of Helena's voice and the crackling of the fire. When the ritual ended, she looked at me and said, "You faced something very difficult and emerged stronger. Don't forget that true strength was always inside you." I sat, feeling her words reverberate deeply. She was right. The entity tried to consume everything I was, but I resisted. Now, although the scars remained, I knew I could choose not to let them control me. Weeks after the visit, I received something unexpected, a letter from Marcus. I hadn't heard from him since the ritual, and although I hoped he was trying to rebuild his life, his words brought a mixture of emotions. The letter was short, written in a trembling handwriting that revealed his fragility. "Eliza, I know I shouldn't contact you, but I needed to say I'm sorry. What I did marked us in a way I never imagined. I'm trying to move forward, but the entity still haunts me in my dreams. I don't know if I'll ever be able to rid myself of it completely." Upon finishing reading, I was overcome by a deep sadness. Marcus had made a terrible mistake, but he was paying a high price for it. Unlike me, he seemed unable to find peace. He apologized again, recognizing his mistakes, but didn't expect a response. I decided not to respond. Our story had ended, and resuming any contact would be opening wounds that were beginning to heal. I sincerely wished he would find a path to his liberation, but I knew I couldn't do anything more for him. Our paths were traced in opposite directions, and moving forward was the only choice left for us both. Despite the scars, my life began to find a balance. I continued my work as a luxury escort, but with a completely different vision. The shine and sense of control that used to move me no longer meant as much. Now my focus was purely practical, work enough to support my grandmother and myself. But deep down, I knew this wouldn't be my reality forever. Over time, I learned to protect myself, both emotionally and spiritually. The shadows that once haunted me still seemed to be lurking, but I knew I had the necessary strength to keep them away. Helena had taught me an important truth. Darkness never completely disappears, but as long as I didn't allow it to dominate me, I could move forward. And that's what I did, one day at a time. I began to rebuild who I was. Evil had crossed my path, but it didn't have the power to define my future. The choice of what to do with my life was, and always had been, in my hands. It's been nearly 7 years since this incident, but the details remain vivid in my memory. I should mention that this is my version of events. It would be interesting to hear my mother's perspective, though she doesn't recall it with the same clarity. Back then, I was living in a small coastal town in Maine, where entertainment options were severely limited. The local mall was the focal point of everything, of course. There was a rundown movie theater and a few bowling lanes, but recreational choices were scarce at best. My mother worked at a department store in the mall, and with little else to do, I often accompanied her. I'd spend most of my time in the employee break room while she completed her shift. For me, it was an escape from our cramped apartment. Sometimes I'd wander around the mall or grab something to eat in the food court. But honestly, I preferred staying in my corner, playing on my Nintendo Switch. I was introverted and enjoyed my solitude. My mother's coworkers were always friendly, frequently checking in to see if I needed anything or just to say hello. On weekends, if I was lucky, I could convince my mother to pick up my friend, who was actually my girlfriend. Since we were two girls in a relationship and didn't want that to become public knowledge in our conservative town, we kept everything secret. Going to the mall provided the perfect excuse to escape household chores, while still having our discreet meetings. My girlfriend, however, didn't share my enthusiasm for sitting in the break room. She preferred walking around the mall, which made sense given her restless nature. For me, though, it was uncomfortable. I didn't share her enthusiasm for long strolls through crowded spaces. I tried persuading her to do something more stationary, like browsing a store or grabbing a bite to eat. I soon realized that her issue with the break room wasn't just about preferences. She seemed genuinely uneasy there, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked her directly what bothered her so much. I expected something obvious, perhaps the cramped space or the flickering fluorescent lights, but her answer caught me off guard. She said she could hear sounds coming from above the ceiling, like someone was walking around up there. The footsteps would start at random times, sometimes slow and deliberate, other times hurried, as if someone was pacing anxiously. My mother had previously mentioned there was a maintenance area above the break room, where cables and insulation were housed. I explained this to my girlfriend, suggesting it was probably just a technician fixing something. Despite this logical explanation, she remained uncomfortable and continued to avoid the break room whenever possible. I understood her unease and wanted to be supportive. I proposed spending more time in the food court or exploring stores instead. Our relationship had very open communication, and even during moments of frustration, I cared about ensuring she felt comfortable. Later that day, I mentioned to my mother what my girlfriend had said and asked what might be getting repaired in the ceiling. Her expression changed immediately. A flash of concern crossed her face before she composed herself. She explained that no maintenance had been scheduled for that day. Then she suggested I follow her to see something. She led me to the receiving area of the store, a space in the back filled with boxes and items waiting to be put on display. The area had an L shape. One section was used for receiving merchandise, while the other led to a hatch that provided access to the ceiling. I should clarify that ceiling access could only be accomplished with assistance from the mall's maintenance team, as the store didn't have proper ladders to reach it. It was a safety protocol. That specific area had just the hatch and nothing more. It was then that I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Markings that resembled scratch marks climbing up the wall toward the hatch. These marks were etched into the concrete, leaving deep brownish-red cuts. I remember clearly how disturbing they looked, almost as if something with claws had been trying to climb up or down. I asked my mother if this was some kind of joke, but she assured me it wasn't. Even more unsettling, she told me this wasn't the first time it had happened. According to her, these marks had appeared several times over the past few months. Whenever they were discovered, security, and the mall's maintenance team were called to clean the wall and investigate. However, these searches never led to anything concrete, and after a while, they stopped paying attention to the problem. The only explanation they could offer was that perhaps some homeless person had found a way to access the ceiling and was skilled enough to hide during searches. After that discovery, I decided not to spend any more time at the mall with my mother. Whenever I wanted to meet my girlfriend, we began choosing other places. Sometimes she would come to my house, and we'd watch TV or just spend time together. Even though nothing serious had happened, I simply couldn't feel at ease anymore. The scratches on that wall haunted my thoughts. They weren't just random marks, they had purpose and direction. They were clearly made by something trying to get in or out of that ceiling space. What bothered me most was how deep they were. Whatever made them had enough strength to dig into solid concrete, leaving those disturbing brownish-red marks. Were they stained with blood? Rust? I never got close enough to examine them properly, and frankly, I didn't want to. My mother never seemed particularly frightened by the situation, which I found odd. She treated it as just another workplace mystery, something to be handled by security or maintenance. But the casual dismissal of something so obviously wrong felt like willful blindness to me. The worst part was the timing of it all. My girlfriend had mentioned hearing footsteps in the ceiling just days before I saw those scratch marks. The connection was impossible to ignore. Whatever was making those sounds wasn't a maintenance worker, at least not any kind of worker that should have been there. I tried researching the mall's history, looking for any stories of accidents or strange occurrences, but found nothing significant. It was built in the late 90s, with no reported deaths during construction or major incidents since then. The building itself had no particularly interesting past, just another commercial structure erected during the mall boom. One night, about a month after seeing the scratch marks, I had a particularly vivid nightmare. I dreamed I was alone in the break room when I heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ceiling. Dust fell between the ceiling tiles as the noise moved directly above me. Then came the scratching, frantic, desperate clawing at the ceiling panel right overhead. In the dream, I was frozen in place as the panel slowly began to move aside, and long, pale fingers with blackened nails started to emerge from the darkness above. I woke up drenched in sweat before I could see what was attached to those fingers. The dream was so disturbing that I told my mother I would never set foot in that mall again, regardless of her work schedule. She didn't argue, perhaps understanding something in my expression conveyed how serious I was. From then on, I either stayed home alone or made plans that didn't involve that place. About 6 months later, my mother quit her job at the department store, citing better opportunities elsewhere. Years passed, and eventually we moved away from that town altogether. I've never been back, and I have no desire to return. Whatever was walking around in the ceiling of that employee break room, whatever left those scratches climbing toward the hatch, I only hope I never cross paths with it again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened, and some spaces, like the dark, dusty area above a department store break room, better left unexplored. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.